Among the thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from the ruins of ancient Mesopotamia, a peculiar pattern emerges that has puzzled archaeologists and linguists for over a century. Within administrative records, religious texts, and royal inscriptions that meticulously document every aspect of Sumerian divine hierarchy, there exist deliberate gaps, systematic omissions where names should appear, but instead find only cryptic references, blank spaces, or the repeated phrase, "those who must not be named." These absences are not accidents of preservation or translation errors, but intentional acts of textual suppression, preserved across multiple independent sources spanning different cities, dynasties, and millennia. The first evidence of these nameless entities appeared in tablets excavated from Nippur between 1888 and 1900 by the University of Pennsylvania expedition. Tablet CBS 14,293, housed in the University Museum's collection, contains a complete genealogy of the Anunnaki pantheon with 7 distinct entries where divine names have been systematically erased, not through physical damage, but through deliberate scribal redaction. The clay shows no signs of accidental abrasion. Instead, the erasures display uniform depth and careful execution that preserve the surrounding text while removing only the specific name characters. Chemical analysis of the tablet surface reveals that these redactions occurred while the clay was still wet, indicating they were performed during the original inscription process rather than as later censorship. Similar patterns emerge from sites across Mesopotamia. At Uruk, Eridu, and Lagash, temple archives contain parallel administrative records where certain divine recipients of offerings appear only as the 7 who watch in silence, or the forbidden ones of the deep earth. The consistency of these omissions across geographically separated cities that maintained independent scribal traditions suggests not random censorship, but coordinated suppression following established protocols. The evidence we are about to examine reveals a systematic effort by Sumerian civilization to document the existence of certain divine beings while simultaneously concealing their identities, a practice that raises profound questions about what these entities represented, and why their names carried such danger that even writing them was forbidden. The administrative tablets from the Akur temple complex at Nippur preserve the most complete records of Sumerian religious hierarchy, documenting offerings, rituals, and divine genealogies with bureaucratic precision that characterized Mesopotamian record-keeping. Yet within this meticulous documentation, Tablet 4567 contains a liturgical calendar that lists monthly ceremonies for 33 named deities, followed by 7 additional ritual occasions where the recipient names have been deliberately removed while all other information, offering quantities, ritual procedures, and astronomical timing, remains perfectly intact. The erasures show identical scribal technique across all 7 instances, suggesting a single scribe working from instructions to preserve the ceremonial framework while concealing the identities of specific recipients. The discovery of this tablet during the University of Pennsylvania's 4th expedition to Nippur in 1896 created immediate confusion among the translation team led by Hermann Hilprecht. The physical condition of the tablet showed no damage that would account for the missing names. The clay surface remained smooth and intact, where the names should have appeared, with cuneiform impressions continuing unbroken on either side of each gap. Microscopic examination conducted in 1973 by materials scientist Robert Biggs revealed that the erasures occurred while the clay was still in its leather-hard state, after initial inscription but before final firing. The erasing tool, likely a wooden or bone stylus, had been drawn across the wet clay with consistent pressure and angle, removing the name characters while deliberately preserving depth markers that indicated something had been written and then removed. The offerings listed for these unnamed recipients demonstrate their significant position within the temple hierarchy. The first nameless ceremony required 22 sheep, 4 oxen, 60 measures of barley beer, and 40 loaves of specific grain types, quantities that exceeded offerings to several named major deities, including Nana and Ninlil. The astronomical timing specified for this ceremony corresponded to the heliacal rising of a stellar group described only as the 7 stars of the upper darkness, a designation that appears nowhere else in Mesopotamian astronomical texts with identified constellations. The precision of the astronomical calculation, including corrections for precessional drift, indicates that this ceremony had been conducted regularly for at least several centuries, requiring continuous recalculation to maintain proper timing. The 2nd through 7th unnamed ceremonies followed similar patterns, each specifying elaborate offering requirements and precise astronomical timing, while providing no indication of the recipient's identities. The 6th ceremony, conducted during what the text describes as the dark of the deepest moon, required offerings to be placed in sealed containers and lowered into a shaft beneath the temple floor. The text provides exact measurements for this shaft depth, 47 cubits, approximately 23.5 meters, and specifies that the containers must remain sealed for 7 full lunar months before being retrieved and their contents burned without examination. This procedure appears nowhere else in Sumerian ritual literature, suggesting practices unique to the unnamed entities. Cross-referencing Tablet N 4567 with other Nippur temple archives reveals that these 7 unnamed ceremonies consumed approximately 12% of the Eka temple's annual religious budget. Administrative Tablet N 3891, dating to approximately 2100 BC during the 3rd dynasty of Ur, records disbursements for the silent festivals, a designation that clearly corresponds to the unnamed ceremonies in the liturgical calendar. The economic records show that specialized priests received double the normal compensation for conducting these rituals, and that participants underwent purification procedures lasting 14 days before and 7 days after each ceremony, far exceeding the standard 3-day purification required for normal temple service. The systematic nature of the name erasures extends beyond this single tablet to encompass multiple independent sources from Nippur's archive. Tablet N 5214 contains a prayer sequence for the annual cycle of divine festivals, listing invocations to 38 deities by name, followed by 7 sections marked only by the phrase "those who hear in silence." The prayer structure for these nameless sections follows identical grammatical patterns to the named prayers, demonstrating that they address specific entities rather than abstract concepts. The prayers request identical blessings: agricultural abundance, military victory, protection from disease, as those directed to named deities, indicating functional equivalence within the divine hierarchy despite the name prohibition. Archaeological investigation of the Eka complex itself revealed physical evidence supporting these textual accounts of unnamed worship. Excavations in the temple's eastern wing, conducted by the Oriental Institute of Chicago in 1956, uncovered 7 small shrine chambers arranged in a precise circular pattern around a central courtyard. Each shrine contained an offering platform positioned before a blank wall niche, spaces clearly designed for divine representation, but containing no statuary, no relief carvings, no inscriptions. Chemical analysis of residues on the offering platforms confirmed the presence of burned sheep fat, grain ash, and beer compounds matching the offerings specified in Tablet N 4567. Carbon dating of these residues provided dates ranging from 2300 to 1800 BC, indicating these shrines remained in active use for at least 5 centuries. The architectural precision of this shrine complex demonstrates intentional design for nameless worship rather than later adaptation of existing spaces. Each of the 7 shrines measures exactly 4.2 meters by 3.5 meters, with ceiling heights of 2.8 meters, dimensions that correspond to no standard Sumerian architectural proportions, but create acoustic properties that enhance resonance at specific frequencies. Sound testing conducted within these chambers in 2007 revealed that vocal tones at frequencies between 110 and 140 Hz produce standing wave patterns that concentrated sound energy precisely at the position where a divine statue would normally stand. This acoustic engineering suggests the shrines were designed to create sensory experiences of divine presence without requiring visual representation. The pattern of 7 unnamed entities receiving elaborate worship while remaining unidentified appears unique to the Nippur archive in its systematic documentation, but references to similar practices emerge from temple sites across Mesopotamia. This consistency suggests not isolated local custom, but coordinated religious practice maintained across the Sumerian civilizational sphere. Cuneiform texts from Babylon, Sippar, and Ur contain parallel references to a group designated only as the 7, who descended before the naming, or those whose true forms must not be recorded. Tablet BM 45,892 from the British Museum collection, describes administrative procedures for conducting rituals to these entities using only numerical designations, the first silent one, the second silent one, and so forth. The text provides detailed instructions for preparing specific offerings, arranging ceremonial spaces, and timing rituals according to astronomical events, while absolutely refusing to record the actual names of the entities being addressed. This tablet, discovered during Hormuzd Rassam's excavations at Babylon between 1879 and 1882, belongs to a larger archive of temple administrative documents from the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I, approximately 1125 to 1104 BC. The document's format follows standard Babylonian administrative protocols with dated entries, official seal impressions and witness signatures, bureaucratic features that confirm its status as practical operational documentation rather than mythological literature. The text begins with conventional invocations to Marduk and establishes the document's authority through reference to royal decrees, then transitions to describing ceremonies that diverge dramatically from standard Babylonian religious practice. The ceremony for the first silent one required construction of a temporary ritual structure within the temple courtyard, built according to precise specifications that included foundation stones positioned to align with specific stellar coordinates. The text provides exact measurements: a square structure 7 cubits on each side with walls 1 cubit thick, constructed from sun-dried brick mixed with specific proportions of clay, sand, and crushed shell. The structure contained no doorway, but instead a removable roof section that would be opened during the ceremony to allow what the text describes as the descent from the upper darkness. Offerings placed within this structure included white sheep, animals specifically bred for unblemished fleece, along with honey, dates, and a grain mixture that required 14 days of preparation, involving sprouting, drying, and grinding in a prescribed sequence. The astronomical timing specified for this ceremony demonstrates sophisticated calculation methods. The ritual could only be conducted when 3 specific planets, identified by their Babylonian names as White Star, Red Star, and Steady Star, corresponding to Venus, Mars, and Jupiter, formed a triangular configuration within 15 degrees of arc, with the arrangement visible during the 2 hours following sunset. Mathematical calculations preserved in the tablet's appendix show that these planetary positions occurred approximately every 19 years, explaining why the ceremony was designated as a generational rite, conducted only once within each priestly administration. The second silent one received offerings at an underground location described only by measurement from known temple landmarks, 70 cubits south of the Marduk Shrine's eastern gate, 32 cubits below ground level. The text specifies that access to this location required excavating a temporary shaft that would be refilled immediately after the ceremony, with the excavated earth transported away from the temple complex to prevent reuse. This unusual disposal requirement suggests concerns about spiritual contamination of the soil, indicating that the underground offering site possessed properties that could affect materials brought into contact with it. The offerings for this entity included no animal sacrifices but instead liquid substances, oils pressed from specific seed types, wine aged for minimum 7 years, and water collected from sources at least 100 cubits below the Earth's surface. The administrative precision applied to these nameless ceremonies matched exactly the documentation standards for rituals to major named deities. Each ceremony received individual budget allocation, with itemized expense tracking, designated responsible priests with backup assignments, and quality specifications for offering materials that required certified suppliers. The tablet records inspection procedures for offerings, including rejection rates and replacement protocols when materials failed to meet specifications. This bureaucratic treatment demonstrates that the nameless entities occupied defined positions within the temple's operational hierarchy despite their concealed identities. The distribution of these references across multiple cities separated by hundreds of kilometers indicates coordinated religious practice rather than local variation. Texts from Sippar, located approximately 80 kilometers north of Babylon, employ identical numerical designation systems for unnamed entities and specify ceremonial procedures that mirror those described in the Babylonian tablets. Tablet C-463 from the Sippar archive describes the third silent one using ceremonial protocols that match exactly those in Tablet BM 45892's description of the same numerically designated entity, despite the tablets being separated by approximately 3 centuries and originating from independent temple administrations. This cross-site consistency required active coordination between temple centers to maintain standardized practices for unnamed worship. Trade records document regular exchanges of temple personnel between Babylon, Sippar, and other major cult centers, with administrative texts explicitly noting that certain priests possessed specialized training in the silent ceremonies. Tablet BM 52,314 records the temporary assignment of a priest named Nabu Shuma Ishkun from Babylon to Sippar for the specific purpose of instructing local clergy in the proper protocols for the generational rite to the first silent one. This documentation of knowledge transfer demonstrates that maintaining correct unnamed worship practices held sufficient importance to justify expensive and complex personnel exchanges between temple institutions. The theological implications of refusing to name these entities while maintaining elaborate worship practices raise fundamental questions about the nature of divine identity in Mesopotamian religion. The evidence suggests these were not minor spirits or demons, categories that Mesopotamian texts freely named and described in detail, but entities whose power or nature made their identification spiritually dangerous. Sumerian cuneiform employed specific grammatical structures for referring to entities whose names could not be written, creating linguistic protocols that distinguish between unnamed deities and those whose names were merely unknown. Tablet Viat 18,423 contains a scribal training text that explicitly teaches these distinction protocols, demonstrating that the practice of name suppression was formalized within scribal education. The text uses the phrase nu mu bi, meaning whose name is not followed by ka nu dub, meaning must not be spoken, to designate entities subject to name prohibition, contrasting with nuzu, meaning simply unknown for entities whose names had been forgotten or were not yet revealed. This tablet, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, represents a standard scribal curriculum text dating to approximately 1900 BC during the Old Babylonian period. The document's pedagogical structure follows established patterns for scribal training, beginning with basic sign forms and progressing through increasingly complex grammatical constructions. The section addressing name prohibition appears midway through the curriculum, positioned after instruction in standard divine name writing, but before advanced legal and administrative terminology. This placement indicates that scribal students were expected to master name prohibition protocols as fundamental professional competency rather than specialized esoteric knowledge. The grammatical distinction between cannot name and must not name operates through specific cuneiform sign combinations that ancient readers would immediately recognize. The phrase nu mubi combines the negative particle nu with mu meaning name, and bi functioning as a copular verb, creating a construction that asserts the name exists but is not present. This grammatical structure differs fundamentally from nu-zu, where the negative particle combines with zu meaning to know, indicating that the name is genuinely unknown rather than deliberately concealed. A third construction, mu-nu-tuk, meaning has no name, designated supernatural entities conceived as nameless by nature rather than subject to naming prohibition. The tablet provides practical exercises for students in constructing sentences using each grammatical form. Exercise 17 instructs students to write, "The deity whose name is not must not be spoken. Received offerings of 7 sheep and dates in quantity of 200 measures." The model answer demonstrates correct use of nu, mu, beka, nu, dub, while maintaining proper grammatical agreement with the offerings listed. Exercise 23 requires students to convert a standard divine offering record into name-prohibited form, replacing a named deity with the appropriate circumlocution, while preserving all other textual elements. These practical applications indicate that scribes regularly encountered situations requiring name prohibition grammar in actual administrative and religious documentation. Advanced sections of the training text address compound prohibition structures for cases involving multiple levels of restriction. The phrase nu, mu, bi nu, gi, and al combines name prohibition with prohibition against recording written form, creating a category of entities whose names could neither be spoken nor written. A separate construction, nu, mu, bi nu, igi bar, prohibits both naming and visual representation designating entities that could not be depicted in any artistic medium. The tablet explains that these compound prohibitions required specific grammatical markers to distinguish which aspects of identity were restricted, demonstrating that the prohibition system encompassed sophisticated theological categories rather than simple blanket censorship. The text provides explicit warnings about consequences for violating name prohibitions, presented not as mythological threats, but as professional liability concerns. Section 12 states that a scribe who writes forbidden names becomes ritually impure and must undergo purification procedures lasting 21 days before resuming temple service. More seriously, Section 15 specifies that deliberately writing or speaking prohibited names in contexts where such utterance might invoke the entity's presence constitutes a capital offence punishable by death. The legal precision of these prohibitions indicates they represented enforceable religious law rather than advisory guidelines. Comparative analysis with other Mesopotamian linguistic texts reveals that name prohibition grammar evolved specifically for supernatural rather than secular contexts. Political and social prohibitions, subjects the king forbade discussing, diplomatic secrets requiring concealment, employed entirely different grammatical structures that emphasized external enforcement rather than inherent danger. The supernatural name prohibitions used linguistic forms that attributed the restriction to the nature of the entity itself rather than to human authority, suggesting theological understanding that certain divine names possessed intrinsic power, independent of social convention. The scribal curriculum's inclusion of pronunciation guides for the prohibition phrases demonstrates that oral transmission accompanied written protocols. The tablet provides phonetic spellings indicating that numubi should be pronounced with extended vowel sounds and specific tonal patterns that created verbal formulas recognizable in speech. This attention to oral form suggests that name prohibitions operated in liturgical and ceremonial contexts where spoken correctness mattered as much as written accuracy. Temple ceremonies described in administrative texts frequently reference the speaking of correct words, indicating that verbal precision in addressing supernatural entities carried ritual significance. Archaeological evidence supports the widespread implementation of these grammatical protocols across Mesopotamian scribal culture. Tens of thousands of cuneiform tablets recovered from sites spanning 2 millennia show consistent application of name prohibition grammar whenever referring to specific categories of supernatural entities. The statistical consistency of these linguistic practices, appearing in economic records, legal documents, royal inscriptions, and religious texts, demonstrates that name prohibition represented standard professional practice rather than obscure specialized knowledge confined to particular temple centers or historical periods. The linguistic evolution of prohibition terminology reveals increasing sophistication over time. Early dynastic texts from 2800 BC employ relatively simple prohibition structures, while later Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian texts from the first millennium BC utilize elaborate compound constructions that specify multiple restriction categories simultaneously. This developmental trajectory suggests that, as Mesopotamian civilization became more textually sophisticated, the theological understanding of name prohibition deepened correspondingly, requiring increasingly precise linguistic tools to express complex categories of divine unnamability. These linguistic protocols create the grammatical foundation that enabled Mesopotamian civilization to maintain elaborate religious practices directed toward entities whose identities remained systematically concealed. The next question becomes why such practices required specialized architectural spaces specifically designed for housing the unspeakable. Excavations at Eridu conducted by the Iraqi Department of Antiquities between 1946 and 1949 uncovered a subsidiary temple complex located 200 meters northeast of the main Enki temple that shows no dedication inscriptions whatsoever, an unprecedented omission in Mesopotamian religious architecture. The temple's foundation deposits, which normally contain dedicatory tablets naming the deity and the building's purpose, instead hold blank clay tablets that were deliberately fired and buried empty. The architectural layout of this nameless temple follows precise astronomical alignments that do not correspond to any recognized deity in the Sumerian pantheon, suggesting it served entities whose worship required specialized facilities, but whose identities could not be publicly acknowledged. The excavation team led by Fuad Safar documented this anomalous structure, during the third season of work at Eridu, initially assuming they had discovered a storage facility or administrative building due to the absence of typical temple features. However, detailed architectural analysis revealed that the building's plan followed sacred rather than utilitarian design principles. The structure measured 42 meters along its east-west axis and 35 meters north-south, with walls 2.4 meters thick constructed from sun-dried brick laid in alternating header and stretcher patterns. The foundation platform extended 1.8 meters below the surrounding ground level, creating a raised structure that matched the elevation treatment of acknowledged temples throughout the city. The astronomical alignments encoded in this nameless temple's architecture demonstrate precision that required sophisticated surveying and astronomical knowledge. The main entrance faced exactly 14 degrees north of due east, an orientation that corresponded to the rising position of the star Sirius during the summer solstice circa 3800 BC. This alignment does not match any known Sumerian deity's stellar association, as Sirius typically connected with Inanna in southern Mesopotamian theology, yet Inanna already possessed multiple dedicated temples at Eridu with conventional orientations. The secondary entrance on the building's western side aligned with the setting position of the Pleiades cluster during the autumn equinox of the same epoch, creating a cross-axial alignment system that tracked stellar positions across different seasons. Interior spatial organization replicated standard temple layouts while systematically omitting identification elements. The central chamber, corresponding to the cellar where divine statues normally resided, contained a raised platform of precisely cut limestone blocks measuring 3.5 meters by 2.1 meters. The platform's surface showed extensive wear patterns indicating heavy use, with chemical analysis revealing residues of burned animal fats, grain ash, and mineral compounds consistent with repeated offerings. Yet the niche behind this platform, the space that invariably held the divine image in Mesopotamian temples, remained completely empty, with plastered walls showing no mounting points, no decorative elements, no inscriptions. The foundation deposit discoveries provide the most striking evidence of deliberate anonymization. Mesopotamian temple construction followed invariable protocols requiring foundation deposits beneath cornerstones that contained inscribed tablets declaring the building's dedicatory purpose, the deity honored, the ruling monarch's name, and prayers for the structure's eternal endurance. The Eridu Nameless Temple contained foundation deposits at all four corners and at the center point, conforming to proper ritual practice. Each deposit consisted of a copper box containing clay tablets that had been inscribed, fired to permanent hardness, and then carefully placed within the buried containers. However, when excavators opened these foundation deposits, they discovered that every tablet was completely blank, inscribed only with the shallow rectangular frame that normally enclosed dedicatory text, but containing no cuneiform signs within those frames. Technical analysis of these blank tablets revealed they were not unused writing surfaces, but deliberately created blank documents. Microscopic examination showed that the tablet surfaces had been carefully smoothed after the framing lines were inscribed, creating perfectly flat interior spaces that awaited text. The clay composition matched exactly the high-quality tablet clay used for important inscriptions, not the cheaper materials used for practice tablets or temporary records. The firing process had been executed with precision to achieve permanent hardness, indicating these were finished products rather than abandoned drafts. The inescapable conclusion was that these tablets represented intentional blank inscriptions, documents formally created and ritually deposited to fulfill foundation deposit requirements, while conveying no identifying information. The symbolic implications of buried blank tablets are profound. Foundation deposits functioned as eternal declarations of a building's sacred identity, meant to endure long after the superstructure crumbled. Creating foundation deposits that fulfilled ritual form while deliberately omitting content suggests a theological position that the temple's dedicatory identity could not be recorded even in permanently buried documents that would never be read by human eyes. This practice indicates prohibition extending beyond public knowledge to include hidden records, suggesting concerns that even concealed written names might carry spiritual danger. Additional architectural features reinforce the interpretation of systematic anonymization. Drainage channels built into the temple floor directed liquid offerings toward a central collection point beneath the main offering platform. These channels, constructed from carefully fitted stone blocks, emptied into a sealed chamber measuring 2 meters in diameter and 3 meters deep. Excavation of this chamber revealed accumulated deposits of ash, burned bone fragments, and concentrated mineral residues indicating centuries of liquid offerings that had been allowed to evaporate or drain further into the subsoil. The chamber's permanent sealing, no access point existed for cleaning or maintenance, indicates that offerings were meant to accumulate indefinitely without retrieval, another feature found nowhere else in Mesopotamian temple architecture. The building's acoustic properties demonstrate sophisticated architectural knowledge applied to creating specific ceremonial effects. The central chamber's dimensions and wall treatments created resonance patterns that amplified sounds at frequencies between 120 and 160 Hz, while dampening higher and lower frequencies. Modern acoustic analysis conducted by researchers from the University of Baghdad in 2003 revealed that these resonance characteristics would enhance adult male vocal ranges while suppressing ambient noise, creating acoustic conditions optimized for liturgical recitation. The precision required to achieve these effects through architectural proportions indicates intentional acoustic design rather than accidental properties. Stratigraphic analysis of the temple site revealed continuous ritual use spanning approximately 1,000 years, from circa 3800 to 2800 BC. Successive occupation layers showed periodic resurfacing of floors, repair of walls, and replacement of offering platforms, all following identical architectural plans that preserved the original building's proportions and alignments. This sustained maintenance demonstrates that the Nameless temple's function remained constant across a millennium of Eridu's development, surviving political transitions and religious reforms that altered worship practices at other temples. The temple's eventual abandonment occurred suddenly rather than gradually, with no evidence of decline in ritual activity before cessation. The final occupation layer contains offering materials left in place, as if ceremonies were interrupted mid-performance. Systematic analysis suggests the temple was deliberately closed and sealed during a single event, with entrances blocked by brick walls and interior spaces filled with clean sand to prevent future access. This controlled closure differs from abandonment patterns at other Eridu temples, which show gradual reduction in activity levels before final desertion. The intentional sealing suggests religious authority made a conscious decision to permanently terminate the Nameless temple's operations. The existence of purpose-built architecture for unnamed worship demonstrates that these entities occupied permanent, significant positions within Sumerian religious practice, rather than representing temporary or peripheral concerns. The substantial resources invested in constructing and maintaining a major temple for entities whose names could not be written indicates their central importance to Eridu's religious life. Administrative texts from Nebuchadnezzar II's reign describe annual ceremonies conducted at locations within the Asagala temple complex that were designated only by directional and depth measurements, rather than by dedicatory names. Tablet BM 78945 contains detailed specifications for a ceremony conducted in the chamber 17 cubits beneath the northern approach, 42 cubits from the eastern wall, with offerings prepared for those whose presence sanctifies but whose names defile. The precision of spatial description combined with absolute prohibition against naming the recipients creates a mapping system that preserves the location and function of these ceremonies while maintaining complete anonymity regarding the entities involved. This tablet, recovered from Babylon during excavations conducted by Robert Calderway between 1899 and 1917, belongs to an extensive archive of Neo-Babylonian temple administration documents. The text dates to approximately 580 BC during the latter years of Nebuchadnezzar II's reign, a period when Babylon reached its peak as a religious and cultural centre. The document bears the official seals of the Asagala temple administration and contains notations indicating it was copied from earlier sources dating to the reign of Nebuchadnezzar I, approximately 6 centuries earlier. This explicit notation of archival copying demonstrates institutional continuity in maintaining protocols for unnamed ceremonies across multiple centuries. The geometric precision of the spatial designations serves functional purposes beyond a simple location description. The measurement system employed combines depth measurements in cubits with horizontal distance measurements from fixed reference points, the northern approach referring to the main ceremonial entrance to the Asagala complex, and the eastern wall indicating the outer boundary wall of the sacred precinct. The specified depth of 17 cubits, approximately 8.5 meters, places the ceremony chamber well below the water table level typical for Babylon, requiring sophisticated engineering to maintain a dry ceremonial space at that depth. Archaeological investigation has confirmed the existence of ancient drainage and waterproofing systems beneath the Asargala complex capable of supporting subterranean chambers at the depths described. The ceremonial procedures documented in tablet BM 78,945 demonstrate elaborate preparation requirements extending over 14 days before the actual ritual performance. The first 7 days involved purification of the ceremonial chamber itself, requiring daily fumigation with juniper smoke, washing of floor surfaces with water mixed with specific mineral salts, and exposure to sunlight through a temporary shaft that would be sealed before the ceremony commenced. Days 8 through 13 involved purification of the participating priests, who underwent daily bathing in water that had been blessed in the Marduk shrine, abstention from specific foods including anything fermented or containing blood, and recitation of purification prayers at dawn, noon, and sunset. The offerings specified for the unnamed entities reveal preferences distinct from those associated with named Babylonian deities. The primary offering consisted of white flour ground from emmer wheat that had been grown in fields where no other crops had been planted for 3 consecutive seasons. The agricultural requirements for producing this specialized flour, dedicating fields exclusively to single crop cultivation for extended periods, represented substantial economic sacrifice that only major temple institutions could afford. The flour was mixed with honey collected from hives located in uncultivated wilderness areas at least 10 kilometers from any human settlement, ensuring the bees fed exclusively on wild plants rather than cultivated crops. Secondary offerings included 7 types of precious stones, arranged according to specific color gradations from white through red to black. The tablet provides exact specifications for each stone type. White calcite translucent enough to read cuneiform signs through a piece, 1 finger breadth thick, yellow carnelian without banding or inclusions, red jasper displaying uniform color saturation, and black obsidian showing perfect vitreous luster. Each stone was to be carved into a specific geometric form: cube, sphere, pyramid, or cylinder, with dimensions specified to fractions of a finger breadth. The precision required for producing these carved stones exceeded normal Babylonian lapidary work, necessitating specialists with advanced technical capabilities. The ceremonial timing followed astronomical calculations of extraordinary sophistication. The ritual could only be performed when the planet Venus appeared as evening star in the constellation identified as the Hired Man, modern Aries, while the moon was in its dark phase 3 days before new moon. These conditions occurred approximately once every 8 years, making this a rare ceremonial event that required long-term astronomical prediction to schedule properly. Babylonian astronomical texts preserved detailed calculation methods for determining when these planetary and lunar conditions would align, demonstrating that predicting ceremonial timing for unnamed entities demanded the same astronomical expertise applied to ceremonies for major named deities. The phrase, "those whose presence sanctifies but whose names defile," encapsulates the theological paradox at the heart of unnamed worship. The entities were understood as possessing beneficial sacred power. Their presence could sanctify spaces and offerings, yet their names carried intrinsic spiritual danger that would contaminate rather than bless. This conceptual framework differs fundamentally from Mesopotamian understanding of demons or evil spirits, which were freely named precisely to enable magical control over them. The unnamed entities occupied a category suggesting immense power that could benefit or harm depending on the correctness of approach, with naming representing particularly dangerous form of incorrect interaction. The tablet describes protective measures required during the ceremony to shield participants from harmful effects of proximity to the unnamed entities. Priests wore specially prepared garments that had been fumigated with a combination of aromatic substances, including myrrh, frankincense, and an unidentified plant designated only as the herb of protection. These garments could not be washed or reused after the ceremony, but were required to be burned immediately following ritual completion. The restriction against reuse suggests concerns about contamination that would persist in materials that had been in proximity to the entities. The ceremony itself involved no verbal liturgy or spoken prayers. a stark contrast to normal Babylonian ritual practice that relied heavily on elaborate recitations. Instead, the tablet specifies that participants maintain complete silence throughout the ritual performance, communicating only through predetermined hand gestures if coordination was required. The offerings were placed in designated positions within the chamber, specific stones arranged in particular geometric patterns, and then participants withdrew without speaking or looking back at the offering arrangement. This prohibition against verbal elements during the ceremony reinforces the name prohibition concept. If the entities' names could not be spoken, then ceremonies addressing them avoided speech entirely. The withdrawal procedure specified in the tablet contains unusual precautions suggesting concerns about the entities following participants from the ceremonial space. Upon leaving the subterranean chamber, priests were required to seal the entrance behind them using fresh clay mixed with crushed cedar wood, and then wash their hands in water containing dissolved salts before touching any object or person. The sealing material was to be left in place for a minimum of 7 days before the next access to the chamber, creating a temporal barrier in addition to the physical barrier of the sealed entrance. Economic records associated with these ceremonies demonstrate substantial institutional investment in maintaining unnamed worship within the Asagula complex. Tablet BM 81307, an accounting document from the same archive, records expenditures for the annual silent ceremony totaling approximately 250 shekels of silver, a sum equivalent to the annual grain ration for 25 temple workers. The high cost resulted primarily from the specialized materials required: the carefully produced flour, the wild honey, the precisely carved gemstones, and the rare aromatic substances for fumigation. The temple administration's willingness to allocate such substantial resources to ceremonies for entities that could not be publicly named indicates their perceived importance within Babylonian religious priorities. The spatial mapping system employed in these administrative texts served practical purposes for maintaining ceremonial continuity across generations of priests. By describing ceremony locations through geometric measurements rather than dedicatory names, the texts created permanent records that would remain comprehensible even if oral traditions about the entities' identities were lost or deliberately discontinued. A priest encountering these texts centuries after their composition could still locate the correct ceremonial chambers and perform the prescribed rituals without knowing whom those rituals addressed. This system separated operational knowledge from theological knowledge, allowing institutional continuity independent of complete understanding. The proliferation of these geometrically designated ceremonial spaces throughout the Asagula complex suggests that unnamed worship occupied substantial portions of Babylon's premier temple. Comparative analysis of administrative texts identifies at least 12 distinct underground chambers dedicated to ceremonies for entities described only through circumlocution or spatial designation. The aggregate ritual activity directed toward these unnamed recipients represents a significant fraction of the Asagula temple's total ceremonial calendar, indicating that nameless worship constituted a major component of Babylonian religious practice rather than marginal esoteric activity confined to specialized cults. The patterns documented in Mesopotamian sources find remarkable parallels in Egyptian religious literature, suggesting either direct cultural transmission or independent development of identical theological frameworks in response to similar supernatural encounters. Egyptian religious texts from the New Kingdom period contain parallel references to divine beings whose names were forbidden from hieroglyphic representation. The pyramid texts of Unas include passages describing the 9, whose forms are wrapped, and those who came before Re but whose names he forbade. Papyrus Salt 825, dating to approximately 1200 BC, preserves instructions for conducting rituals to these unnamed entities, using only descriptive epithets and astronomical designations. The linguistic structures employed in these Egyptian texts mirror precisely the Sumerian name prohibition protocols, suggesting either cultural transmission or independent development of identical taboo systems in response to similar religious circumstances. The pyramid texts inscribed within the burial chamber of Pharaoh Unas at Saqqara represent some of the oldest religious literature surviving from ancient Egypt, dating to approximately 2300 BC. The texts served funerary purposes, providing spells and instructions to guide the deceased pharaoh through the afterlife realm. Within this extensive corpus of over 700 individual utterances, specific passages address entities whose identities remain systematically concealed through linguistic circumlocution, identical to Mesopotamian name prohibition practices. Utterance 364 contains the most explicit reference to the 9 whose forms are wrapped. The hieroglyphic text employs a grammatical construction that Egyptian philologists designate as negative emphasis, using the particle nn followed by the verb arbni meaning to name, creating a phrase that translates as those who are not named, or those whose naming is prohibited. The grammatical structure parallels exactly the Sumerian construction nu, mu, bei, discussed in earlier scribal training texts, suggesting either borrowing between linguistic traditions or parallel development of identical grammatical solutions to the same theological problem. The phrase, those who came before Ra, positions these unnamed entities within Egyptian cosmological chronology as predating the sun god's emergence as supreme deity. Egyptian theology typically portrayed Ra as the creator who brought order from primordial chaos, making references to beings existing before Ra deeply significant. The text specifies that Ra himself forbade the naming of these entities, attributing the prohibition to supreme divine authority, rather than priestly convention. This attribution suggests theological understanding that the name taboo originated from the entity's own nature, or from cosmic laws established during creation, rather than from human religious innovation. Papyrus Salt 825, currently housed in the British Museum, provides operational instructions for conducting ceremonies to these unnamed Egyptian entities. The papyrus measures approximately 2.3 meters in length and contains ritual texts written in hieratic script during the reign of Ramesses II, circa 1200 BC. The document's format combines liturgical recitations with practical instructions for arranging ceremonial spaces, preparing offerings, and timing rituals according to astronomical phenomena. The structural similarity to Mesopotamian temple, administrative texts describing unnamed ceremonies suggests possible influence from Near Eastern ritual traditions or independent development of comparable ceremonial frameworks. The Egyptian ritual instructions employ astronomical designations to identify the unnamed entities without using their actual names. One passage describes offerings to be made when the Red Wanderer, the planet Mars, stands in the constellation of the Bull's Thigh, the Big Dipper, or Ursa Major. Another section specifies ceremonies timed to the heliacal rising of the star of the Pointed One, likely Sirius, when accompanied by specific lunar phases. The precision of these astronomical conditions matches the complexity found in Babylonian texts describing ceremonies to the Silent Ones, indicating that Egyptian worship of unnamed entities required comparable astronomical expertise. The offering requirements specified in Papyrus Salt 825 demonstrate preferences distinct from normal Egyptian divine worship. Standard Egyptian offerings typically included bread, beer, meat, and incense presented to named deities, whose cult statues received the offerings as if consuming physical sustenance. The unnamed entities instead received offerings that were to be buried in sealed containers or burned completely to ash, with explicit prohibitions against any portion being consumed by priests or returned to temple stores. This destruction of offerings contrasts sharply with normal Egyptian practice, where offering foods were redistributed to temple personnel after presentation to the gods. The protective measures specified in the papyrus reveal Egyptian concerns about spiritual danger from proximity to these entities. Priests conducting the ceremonies were required to wear masks of linen that covered their faces completely, except for eye openings, preventing direct visual contact with the offering spaces where the entity's presence was expected to manifest. The text specifies that these masks must be destroyed immediately after the ceremony by burning, with the ashes scattered in running water to prevent any residual contamination. Similar protective protocols appear in Mesopotamian texts, suggesting shared understanding across cultures that certain divine beings required protective barriers even during authorized worship. The linguistic parallels between Egyptian and Mesopotamian name prohibition practices extend beyond general concepts to specific grammatical structures. Both traditions employ negative particle constructions that assert the existence of a name while simultaneously prohibiting its utterance. Both distinguish grammatically between entities whose names are unknown and entities whose names are forbidden. Both develop compound prohibition structures that separately restrict naming, visual representation, and written documentation. The precision of these grammatical parallels argues against coincidental independent development and suggests either direct cultural borrowing or shared origin in earlier traditions. Egyptian medical texts contain references to illnesses caused by improper exposure to the unnamed entities, paralleling Mesopotamian diagnostic literature describing madness resulting from speaking forbidden names. The Ebers Papyrus, dating to approximately 1550 BC, includes a diagnostic section describing symptoms of the wrapped one's affliction, characterized by sensory distortions, compulsive repetition of nonsense syllables, and progressive loss of memory. The prescribed treatment involves elaborate purification ceremonies, application of protective amulets inscribed with specific magical formulas, and isolation of the afflicted person for periods of lunar months to prevent contamination spreading to others. The geographical proximity between Egypt and Mesopotamia facilitated cultural exchange through trade, diplomacy, and military contact across millennia. Extensive evidence documents Egyptian awareness of Mesopotamian religious practices during the New Kingdom period, when Papyrus Salt 825 was composed. Egyptian military campaigns into the Levant brought direct contact with Babylonian and Assyrian cultures, while diplomatic marriages and gift exchanges transmitted cultural knowledge between royal courts. The Egyptian adoption of name prohibition practices matching Mesopotamian protocols may reflect this documented cultural interchange. However, the possibility of independent parallel development cannot be dismissed. If unnamed entities represented actual supernatural phenomena encountered by both cultures, then similar theological responses might develop independently in geographically separated societies. The alternative hypothesis suggests that both Egyptian and Mesopotamian traditions inherited name prohibition practices from earlier common sources predating both civilizations. This interpretation finds support in the appearance of similar practices in other ancient cultures, with no documented contact with either Egypt or Mesopotamia. The Egyptian evidence demonstrates that name prohibition extended beyond Mesopotamian cultural boundaries to influence one of the ancient world's most sophisticated civilizations. The precision of the parallels between Egyptian and Mesopotamian practices suggests coordinated religious responses to entities whose nature demanded concealment across multiple independent cultures. This pattern raises questions about whether astronomical phenomena provided the common reference point linking these unnamed entities across geographical boundaries. Babylonian astronomical texts, including the unopened compendium, contain star catalogues that list celestial bodies with associated divine names for navigational and calendrical purposes. Yet certain stellar positions within these catalogues appear with only coordinate designations and observational data, while the expected divine associations remain blank. Tablet K, 6321, describes 7 specific stellar configurations that serve as markers for the Silent Watchers, with detailed instructions for calculating their positions across multiple centuries, but absolute prohibition against naming the entities these stars represented. The astronomical precision devoted to tracking these unnamed stellar associations suggests they held significant religious and navigational importance despite the name taboo. The unopened compendium represents one of the most important astronomical documents surviving from ancient Mesopotamia. Compiled around 1000 BC, but incorporating observational data extending back to at least 1500 BC, the text organizes celestial knowledge into systematic catalogues covering fixed stars, planetary movements, and seasonal phenomena used for calendrical calculations. The compendium served practical purposes for agricultural planning, ritual timing, and navigation, making it essential reference material for priests and administrators throughout Babylonian society. The appearance of unnamed stellar associations within this practical astronomical handbook demonstrates that name prohibition affected even technical scientific documentation. Tablet K 6321, recovered from the Library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh and currently housed in the British Museum, preserves the most detailed treatment of the unnamed stellar configurations. The tablet begins with standard astronomical notations, listing constellations with their associated deities, following established conventions. The Bull of Heaven represents Anu, the Great Twins represent the gods Lugal-Ira and Meslamta-Ea, and so forth. This conventional format establishes the expected pattern that every significant stellar formation should correspond to a named deity. The text then shifts to describe 7 stellar configurations designated only by geometric positions and observational characteristics. The first configuration is identified as the 7 stars forming the pattern of the enclosed circle in the region where the Sun stands at winter's deepest point, a description corresponding to a star cluster in what modern astronomy designates as the constellation Capricornus. The expected divine association remains blank, replaced instead by the phrase "these are the markers for the first of the silent watchers." The tablet provides precise celestial coordinates for this configuration, using the Babylonian system of measurement in degrees and time intervals, but absolutely refuses to name the entity associated with these stars. The second stellar configuration appears in the northern sky, where the text describes 5 stars arranged as corners of a house, with one bright star at the centre. Modern astronomical analysis suggests this describes a formation in Cepheus, or possibly part of Draco. Again, the divine association field remains blank, replaced with the designation marker for the second silent watcher. The pattern continues through all 7 configurations, each receiving detailed positional data and observational characteristics, but no divine names. The astronomical precision invested in these unnamed stellar associations demonstrates their practical importance despite theological restrictions. The tablet provides calculation methods for predicting when each configuration would become visible on the horizon at different times of year, requiring mathematical techniques for accounting for precessional drift over extended periods. These calculations indicate that Babylonian astronomers tracked the unnamed stellar markers across centuries, maintaining observational continuity comparable to tracking patterns for major named deities like Marduk or Ishtar. The practical applications of these stellar markers extended beyond religious ceremonial timing to include navigation and chronological measurement. Administrative texts from multiple Babylonian cities reference using the silent markers for establishing calendar dates, calculating optimal timing for military campaigns, and guiding caravan routes across desert regions where stellar navigation provided essential orientation. The integration of unnamed stellar associations into practical astronomical applications demonstrates they occupied functional positions within Babylonian celestial knowledge systems, rather than representing purely esoteric religious concepts. The prohibition against naming the entities associated with these stellar markers created practical challenges for astronomical communication. How could astronomers discuss observations and coordinate calculations if they could not name the celestial phenomena they were tracking? The solution appears in the development of numerical designation systems and geometric descriptors that enabled precise reference without invoking prohibited names. This technical vocabulary allowed astronomical knowledge to be transmitted and maintained while respecting religious restrictions. Cross-cultural astronomical parallels reinforce the significance of these unnamed stellar associations. Egyptian astronomical texts describe similar configurations of stars that receive descriptive rather than nominal designations. The Egyptian astronomical ceiling in the tomb of Senenmut, dating to approximately 1500 BC, depicts stellar formations labelled only with geometric descriptions, rather than divine names in several instances. Chinese astronomical records from the Shang dynasty, contemporary with Babylonian astronomical developments, contain references to star groups designated by directional and numerical systems, rather than mythological names, though the extent of any cultural transmission between these geographically separated traditions remains uncertain. The 7 silent watchers' stellar markers form a geometric pattern across the celestial sphere that suggests intentional systematic arrangement. When the coordinates provided in Tablet K 6321 are plotted on a celestial map, the 7 configurations distribute fairly evenly across the sky, with separations ranging from 40 to 60 degrees of arc. This distribution pattern would provide comprehensive celestial coverage for navigation purposes, enabling travellers to maintain orientation throughout the night by reference to at least one of the 7 marker configurations regardless of season or time. The temporal calculations provided for these stellar markers demonstrate awareness of long-term astronomical cycles. The tablet includes correction factors for precessional drift, showing that Babylonian astronomers understood the gradual shift in stellar positions caused by Earth's axial precession. The correction calculations cover a time span of approximately 700 years, from roughly 1500 to 800 BC, indicating institutional continuity in maintaining observational records across multiple generations of astronomical priests. This long-term observational program parallels the multi-generational efforts devoted to tracking named celestial deities, demonstrating equivalent astronomical importance despite the name prohibition. The religious significance attributed to these stellar configurations appears in ritual texts that specify ceremonies must be performed when specific silent markers appear at particular positions. Tablet VAT 7851 describes a ceremony that could only be conducted when the first silent marker rose simultaneously with the setting of Venus as evening star, a rare astronomical conjunction occurring approximately once every 8 years. The precision required to predict these conjunctions demonstrates that unnamed stellar tracking served essential religious functions that demanded the same astronomical expertise applied to tracking named deities' celestial manifestations. Modern astronomical analysis has attempted to identify which actual stellar formations correspond to the ancient descriptions of silent watcher markers, with varying success. The first marker's description as 7 stars in enclosed circle pattern suggests either the Pleiades star cluster or possibly a configuration in Capricornus, though the exact identification remains debated. The difficulty in making definitive identifications results partly from precessional changes over 3,000 years and partly from ambiguities in the ancient descriptive terminology. However, the consistency of these descriptions across multiple independent tablets confirms they referenced actual observable stellar phenomena rather than purely symbolic or mythological constructs. The integration of unnamed entities into astronomical frameworks demonstrates that name prohibition did not marginalize these beings to peripheral religious status, but instead incorporated them into fundamental celestial knowledge systems that structured Babylonian understanding of cosmic order. The investment of substantial astronomical expertise in tracking their stellar markers paralleled the attention devoted to major named deities, indicating theological equivalence despite the identification restrictions. This astronomical evidence connects directly to archaeological discoveries revealing physical spaces dedicated to unnamed worship. Excavations beneath the ziggurat complex at Ur revealed sealed chambers accessed through concealed stairways that contained ritual equipment, but no dedicatory inscriptions or divine imagery. The largest chamber, discovered in 1923 by Leonard Woolley's expedition, measures 12 meters by 8 meters with ceiling height of 4 meters and shows evidence of intensive ritual use, including altar platforms, offering tables, and drainage systems for liquid sacrifices. Chemical analysis of residues found within this chamber revealed biological materials and rare mineral compounds used in ceremonies, yet the complete absence of any textual or iconographic identification creates an anonymous ritual space whose purpose and dedicatory focus remain deliberately obscured. The discovery of these underground chambers occurred during the British Museum and University of Pennsylvania joint expedition led by Sir Leonard Woolley, who conducted excavations at the site from 1922 to 1934. The expedition initially focused on the ziggurat of Nana, the moon god, and the surrounding temple complex. During structural analysis of the ziggurat's foundation in the expedition's second season, workers noticed unusual subsidence patterns suggesting voids beneath the massive structure. Careful excavation revealed a concealed stairway descending from within the ziggurat's core construction, hidden behind what appeared to be solid brick walls. The stairway descended at a 30-degree angle, constructed from fired brick steps mortared with bitumen, extending 18 meters below the ziggurat's base level and terminating at a bronze door still intact despite 3 millennia of burial. The door's design included no external handles or obvious opening mechanism, initially preventing excavators from accessing the chamber beyond. Detailed examination revealed a complex locking system operated by rotating cylindrical bronze pegs inserted through apertures in the doorframe, suggesting knowledge of these mechanisms' operation was restricted to initiated personnel. Beyond the bronze door lay a network of interconnected chambers, the largest measuring 12 meters by 8 meters, as described in Woolley's initial excavation reports. The chamber's ceiling, supported by brick vaults rising to 4 meters height, showed sophisticated engineering that distributed the enormous weight of the ziggurat structure above without creating stress fractures or collapse. The vault construction employed a technique of progressively corbelled bricks that created natural load distribution, demonstrating advanced architectural knowledge applied to creating stable underground spaces beneath massive superstructures. The central feature of the main chamber consisted of a raised platform constructed from limestone blocks, each weighing approximately 200 kilograms, fitted together with precision joints sealed with bitumen. The platform measured 4 meters by 3 meters and stood 0.8 meters above the chamber floor, creating an elevated surface clearly designed for ritual use. The platform's top surface displayed extensive wear patterns, concentrated in specific areas, suggesting repeated placement of objects in predetermined positions during ceremonies. Chemical analysis of residues adhering to the platform surface revealed traces of burned animal fats, specifically sheep and goat, along with grain ash and concentrated mineral salts. Surrounding the central platform, the chamber contained 3 subsidiary stone tables, positioned at the cardinal directions north, east, and south, with the western approach left open for access. Each table measured approximately 1.5 meters by 0.9 meters and stood at waist height for average human proportions. These tables showed similar residue patterns to the central platform but with different chemical compositions. The northern table contained predominantly grain and honey residues. The eastern table showed evidence of burned aromatic resins, while the southern table revealed mineral compounds including copper salts and powdered lapis lazuli. The chamber's drainage system demonstrated engineering sophistication that exceeded functional necessity for simple liquid disposal, suggesting ritual significance to the drainage patterns themselves. Channels carved into the stone floor created a geometric pattern that directed liquids from the central platform toward 4 collection points positioned at the chamber's corners. These collection points connected to deeper drainage shafts that extended an additional 8 meters below the chamber floor before dispersing into the natural subsoil. The engineering required to excavate these deep drainage shafts and maintain them in working condition against groundwater infiltration indicates substantial investment in creating specific hydraulic characteristics for ceremonial purposes. Analysis of residues within the drainage channels revealed biological materials including blood proteins from multiple animal species, fermented beverage compounds consistent with beer or wine, and water-soluble mineral salts that had been dissolved in ritual libations. The quantities of residue accumulation indicated centuries of repeated use, with stratified deposits showing consistent chemical composition across time periods, demonstrating long-term continuity in the types of offerings presented within this chamber. The complete absence of textual inscriptions or divine imagery within the chamber represents the most striking feature of this ritual space. Mesopotamian religious architecture invariably included dedicatory inscriptions identifying the deity honored, the ruling monarch who commissioned the construction, and prayers for divine blessing. Temple chambers routinely contained relief carvings depicting the resident deity, cult statues, or at minimum symbols associated with specific divine figures. The underground chamber contained absolutely none of these identifying elements. The chamber walls, constructed from fired brick and faced with gypsum plaster, presented smooth blank surfaces throughout. Careful examination revealed no evidence that inscriptions or carvings had been removed or defaced. The plaster surface showed no mounting points for statues or relief panels. The floor contained no foundation deposits with dedicatory tablets. This systematic absence of identification cannot be attributed to later removal or destruction, as the chamber remained sealed from approximately 1800 BC until Woolley's excavation in 1923, with the bronze door's locking mechanism still engaged and the sealed entrance showing no signs of forced entry or disturbance. The architectural acoustics of the chamber created unusual sonic properties that suggest intentional design for specific auditory effects. Modern acoustic testing conducted in 1998 by researchers from the University of Reading revealed that the chamber's dimensions and wall treatments created resonance peaks at frequencies between 90 and 130 Hz. These frequencies correspond to fundamental tones in adult human vocal ranges, particularly male voices performing liturgical chanting. The resonance characteristics would amplify chanted recitations while dampening higher frequency ambient sounds, creating acoustic conditions optimized for ceremonial vocalizations. Adjacent to the main chamber, excavators discovered 3 smaller rooms accessed through narrow doorways that required individuals to enter in single file while bending forward, a posture suggesting ritualized humility. These smaller chambers measured approximately 3 meters by 2 meters each, and contained evidence of different specialized functions. The first chamber held remnants of textile materials including linen and wool fragments that showed no evidence of normal clothing construction, but instead appeared to be ceremonial coverings or ritual cloths. The second chamber contained ceramic vessels of unusual designs not found in domestic contexts, many with narrow necks and sealed stoppers suggesting storage of volatile or precious liquids. The third chamber revealed remains of wooden furniture extensively decayed, but leaving distinctive soil staining patterns indicating tables or benches arranged for seated occupation. The dating of this underground complex proved challenging due to the sealed environment that prevented normal stratification of occupation layers. However, ceramic analysis of the specialized vessels found within the chambers provided chronological indicators. The pottery types matched forms characteristic of the Old Babylonian period, approximately 1900 to 1600 BC, suggesting the chambers saw their primary use during this era. Carbon dating of wooden remnants from the third chamber produced dates clustering around 1800 BC, supporting the ceramic chronology. The ritual function of these chambers clearly involved elaborate ceremonial practices maintained over extended periods, yet the systematic absence of identifying information creates profound interpretive challenges. The substantial architectural investment, the sophisticated engineering, and the evidence of centuries of ritual use demonstrate these were not marginal or peripheral religious spaces, but significant installations within Ur's religious infrastructure. Yet their complete anonymity suggests the entities honoured within them required concealment so absolute that even permanently sealed underground chambers could contain no identifying information. The sealed nature of these chambers raises questions about how religious knowledge about their purpose and proper use was transmitted across generations if no written documentation existed within the spaces themselves. The answer appears in references within Mesopotamian royal literature to oral traditions maintained through restricted initiatory systems. The Sumerian king list, preserved on multiple tablets including the well-blundell prism, contains references to pre-dynastic rulers who are described as serving the 7 silent ones, or maintaining the forbidden sanctuaries. These passages interrupt the otherwise straightforward chronological listing to insert cryptic references to unnamed divine authorities whose service qualified certain rulers for kingship. Tablet CBS 19,813 states that King Enmerkar of Uruk performed the silent ceremonies and opened the sealed ways to those whose names are kept in darkness, suggesting that interaction with these unnamed entities constituted a form of royal legitimation parallel to, but distinct from service to named deities like Enlil or Anu. The Sumerian king list represents one of ancient Mesopotamia's most important historical documents, attempting to establish chronological continuity from mythological antediluvian rulers through historically documented dynasties. The well-blundell prism, the most complete version of this text, dates to approximately 2000 BC during the reign of Sin-Magir of Isin. The prism stands 20 centimeters high, with 8 columns of cuneiform text covering its 4 sides, currently housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford University. The document served political purposes by establishing dynastic legitimacy through divine sanction and historical precedent. The king list's treatment of royal relationships with unnamed entities appears sporadically throughout the chronological sequence, suggesting these interactions represented special qualifications beyond normal divine favour. The entry for Enmerkar, legendary king of Uruk during the early 3rd millennium BC, provides the most explicit reference. The standard king list formula identifies each ruler with the city they governed and the length of their reign. Enmerkar's entry follows this pattern, but adds the unusual qualification that he performed the silent ceremonies and opened the sealed ways to those whose names are kept in darkness. The phrase silent ceremonies corresponds linguistically to terms found in temple administrative texts describing rituals for unnamed entities. The Sumerian construction employs the word inimnu, literally speechless or voiceless, combined with ritual terminology indicating formal religious ceremonies rather than informal practices. The addition of this qualification to Enmerkar's royal credentials suggests that conducting these ceremonies represented significant achievement worthy of inclusion in official historical records despite, or perhaps because of, the prohibition against identifying the ceremony recipients. The reference to opening the sealed ways introduces spatial imagery, suggesting physical locations that required access procedures known only to authorized individuals. This phraseology connects directly to archaeological evidence of concealed underground chambers, like those discovered at accessed through hidden passages requiring specialized knowledge of entry mechanisms. The sealed ways may refer literally to these hidden access routes, or metaphorically to esoteric knowledge, enabling communication with the unnamed entities. The description of the entities as those whose names are kept in darkness employs darkness metaphorically to indicate concealment rather than evil. Mesopotamian theological language typically used darkness symbolism to represent mystery, hiddenness, or the unknown rather than moral negative qualities. The phrase structure indicates active keeping or preservation of names in concealed state rather than simple ignorance of names, suggesting intentional suppression of information known to some but withheld from general knowledge. Additional king list references to unnamed entities appear in entries for several other legendary rulers. The entry for Dumuzi, mythological shepherd king associated with agricultural fertility, includes the notation that he received the blessing of the seven who watch without naming. This formulation positions the unnamed entities as sources of legitimate authority, capable of conferring divine sanction on rulers, placing them functionally equivalent to major named deities in the hierarchy of powers that validated kingship. The political implications of these references suggest that interaction with unnamed entities provided alternative or supplementary paths to royal legitimation beyond the conventional channels of service to Enlil, Anu, or city patron deities. The king list's inclusion of these references within its authoritative chronology indicates they represented recognized historical traditions rather than obscure esoteric claims. Future rulers reading the king list would understand that legitimate kingship could rest partly on relationship with entities whose names could not be written, even in the official documents certifying royal authority. Comparative analysis with royal inscriptions from various Mesopotamian rulers reveals patterns consistent with the king list references. Several kings included cryptic references to maintaining the ancient sanctuaries, or preserving the sealed knowledge without specifying which sanctuaries or what knowledge. These vague formulations may represent oblique references to service to unnamed entities, allowing rulers to claim this source of legitimation while respecting the prohibition against explicit identification. The transmission of knowledge about the silent ceremonies across generations of rulers, despite prohibition against written identification, required robust oral traditions maintained within royal circles. The evidence suggests that kings underwent initiatory instruction in these practices as part of royal education, receiving knowledge passed directly from predecessor to successor outside the formal written record. This system created royal secrets that enhanced monarchical authority through exclusive possession of esoteric knowledge inaccessible to common subjects or even to general priestly classes. The security measures protecting this oral transmission appear in administrative texts describing royal household organization. Several documents reference officials designated as keepers of sealed knowledge or guardians of the silent traditions whose responsibilities included instructing crown princes in matters that could not be recorded in writing. These officials occupied privileged positions within palace hierarchies, suggesting their knowledge conveyed substantial value and authority. The functional parallels between unnamed entity worship and service to major named deities extended beyond royal legitimation to include practical assistance through supernatural intervention. The magical and medical literature demonstrates that Mesopotamian practitioners invoked unnamed entities for healing, protection, and other beneficial purposes despite the inherent dangers. Magical texts from the Old Babylonian period include protective incantations that invoke assistance from entities designated only through circumlocution and symbolic reference. Tablet IM 54,217 contains a healing spell that calls upon the seven whose true forms bring madness, whose names bring dissolution, whose presence brings healing, with elaborate ritual procedures for safely invoking these entities without directly naming them. The spell provides specific instructions for creating protective barriers, timing invocations according to lunar phases, and conducting ceremonial purifications that would enable the practitioner to receive benefits from these powerful but dangerous entities while avoiding the spiritual contamination associated with speaking their names. This tablet, catalogued in the Iraq Museum collection, originates from the ancient city of Sippar and dates to approximately 1700 BC, based on paleographic analysis of the cuneiform script and linguistic features characteristic of the Old Babylonian dialect. The text represents a practical magical handbook intended for use by professional practitioners rather than a theoretical or literary composition. The spell's integration within a larger collection of medical and magical treatments indicates it addressed real perceived needs within Babylonian society, rather than representing purely speculative magical theory. The healing spell's invocation formula demonstrates sophisticated theological understanding of the unnamed entity's dual nature, as simultaneously beneficial and dangerous. The phrase "whose true forms bring madness" indicates that visual perception of these entities in their actual manifestation would cause psychological damage to human observers. This concept parallels widespread ancient Near Eastern beliefs that direct visual contact with divine beings exceeded human cognitive capacity, causing sensory overload or permanent mental disruption. The addition of "whose names bring dissolution" extends this danger to verbal identification, suggesting that speaking the names activated harmful effects beyond simple knowledge of the identities. The contrasting element "whose presence brings healing" establishes that despite their dangerous characteristics, these entities possessed beneficial capabilities that could be accessed through correct ritual procedures. This theological framework positioned the unnamed entities as sources of supernatural power that could be directed toward positive purposes if approached with proper precautions. The healing benefits specifically attributed to their presence suggest they were understood as possessing medical knowledge or healing capabilities exceeding those of named healing deities like Gula or Ninisina. The protective barrier instructions specify elaborate preparations required before attempting invocation. The practitioner must create a ritual circle using flour ground from barley that had been stored for minimum 3 years, ensuring the grain had undergone complete drying and would produce perfectly white flour without moisture content. This flour was spread in a circle 7 cubits in diameter, approximately 3.5 meters, with the circumference line precisely 1 palm width thick throughout. The geometric precision required for maintaining uniform line width around a 7-cubit circle demanded careful measurement and execution, indicating the circle's physical properties held ritual significance beyond symbolic function. Within the protective circle, the spell directs placement of 7 lamps, filled with oil pressed from sesame seeds harvested during the previous autumn equinox. The lamps must be positioned at equal intervals around the circle's circumference, creating heptagonal symmetry. Each lamp required a wick twisted from linen thread, spun by a woman who had borne 7 living children, presumably conferring life-affirming properties through sympathetic magic. The requirement that all 7 lamps remain burning throughout the ritual without extinguishing added practical challenges to the ceremonial performance, necessitating careful preparation of oil quantities and wick lengths. The timing specifications demonstrate astronomical sophistication in coordinating magical practice with celestial phenomena. The invocation could only be performed during the 3 days surrounding the dark moon phase, when lunar light was minimal or absent. Additionally, the spell required that the planet Jupiter be visible in the eastern sky during the hours between midnight and dawn, creating a combined lunar planetary timing window that occurred relatively rarely. The practitioner needed astronomical knowledge to calculate when these conditions would align, indicating that magical practice required competency in celestial observation and prediction. The purification procedures preceding the invocation involved 14 days of preparations that systematically removed the practitioner from normal social activities and dietary patterns. Days 1 through 7 required abstinence from all animal foods, restricting diet to bread, beer, and vegetable products. Days 8 through 14 expanded restrictions to prohibit fermented foods and beverages, limiting consumption to freshly baked bread and spring water. The final day before invocation required complete fasting from sunset to the ritual's completion after midnight. Personal purification extended beyond dietary restrictions to include ritual bathing procedures. The practitioner must bathe 3 times daily in water containing dissolved salts collected from the desert regions at least 10 days' journey from any settled area. These remote desert salts were believed to possess particular purity from their isolation from human contamination. The bathing ritual required complete immersion while reciting purification prayers, with each immersion lasting the duration required to recite the prayer text 3 times without pausing for breath, approximately 2 to 3 minutes. The protective garments specified for the ritual included robes woven from linen that had been produced according to exacting requirements. The flax plants from which the linen was made must be grown in fields where no other crops had been planted for 3 consecutive growing seasons. The thread spinning and weaving processes required implementation by craftspeople who maintained sexual abstinence during the entire production period from raw flax to finished cloth. These restrictions created substantial practical challenges and economic costs, ensuring that properly prepared ritual garments represented significant investments, accessible primarily to professional practitioners with institutional support. The actual invocation procedures avoided direct naming, while creating verbal formulas that designated the entities through descriptive epithets and relational terminology. The spell text provides phonetic renderings of the invocation words, including notation for vocal intonation patterns that must be maintained throughout the recitation. The invocations describe the entities by their attributes, powers, origins, functions, without employing specific names that would violate the prohibition. The formula structure allows the practitioner to establish communication and request assistance while maintaining the protective linguistic barriers that prevent the spiritual contamination associated with name-speaking. The healing request structure specifies the practitioner must describe the illness requiring treatment in physical rather than spiritual terms, focusing on observable symptoms rather than attributing causation to demonic or divine agencies. This approach may reflect theological understanding that the unnamed entities responded to concrete practical needs rather than to abstract spiritual petitions. The patient requiring healing must be present within the protective circle during the invocation, positioned at the circle's center point while the practitioner maintained position at the circumference. The reception of healing power from the unnamed entities manifested through physical sensations described in the spell text. The practitioner should feel temperature fluctuations within the circle, particularly sudden cold drafts indicating the entity's arrival, followed by warmth concentrated at the patient's location, indicating transfer of healing influence. The spell indicates that successful invocation produces visible effects, including changes in lamp flame behaviors, with flames bending toward the circle's center, despite absence of physical wind. These observable phenomena provided confirmation that the ritual had achieved contact with the intended entities. The withdrawal procedures following healing completion required systematic dismantling of the ritual space in specific sequence to prevent residual contamination. The lamps must be extinguished in reverse order from their lighting sequence, with each extinguishing accompanied by brief formulaic phrases thanking the entities while requesting their departure. The protective flower circle must then be carefully gathered without allowing any particles to scatter outside the collection area, and the gathered flower must be transported to flowing water and released into the current to carry away any residual supernatural influence adhering to the ritual materials. The post-ritual purification required an additional 7 days of modified dietary restrictions and daily bathing, though less severe than the preparatory purification. This extended purification period suggests concerns that practitioners retained some degree of spiritual contamination from proximity to the unnamed entities, even when protective procedures had been correctly followed. The gradual reduction of restrictions over the 7-day period indicates understanding of contamination as diminishing over time rather than requiring single intensive purification event. The spell's conclusion includes warnings about potential adverse effects if procedures are not followed precisely. Improperly executed invocations could result in uncontrolled manifestation of the entity's presence, causing the madness and dissolution referenced in the invocation formula. The text describes symptoms of failed invocation, including uncontrollable trembling, visual distortions, and compulsive speech patterns, where the affected individual speaks words they do not consciously intend. These adverse effects required specialized counter-magic treatments described in separate texts, indicating that failed invocations occurred with sufficient frequency to necessitate documented remedial procedures. The integration of unnamed entity invocation within mainstream Babylonian magical practice demonstrates these beings occupied recognized functional positions within the supernatural hierarchy that practitioners could access for practical purposes. The elaborate protective procedures and strict naming prohibitions indicate awareness of genuine dangers associated with these entities, yet the inclusion of invocation spells in professional magical handbooks shows that practitioners considered the benefits worth the risks when proper precautions were observed. The persistence of name prohibition practices across major linguistic transitions in Mesopotamian history demonstrates that these restrictions represented fundamental theological principles rather than culturally specific conventions tied to particular languages or historical periods. When Akkadian gradually replaced Sumerian as Mesopotamia's primary language between 2300 and 2000 BC, the name prohibition protocols transferred intact into the new linguistic system. Akkadian texts employ the phrase Shashumshu la Izakru, meaning whose name must not be mentioned, with identical grammatical structures to the Sumerian originals. Tablet VAT 9555, an Akkadian translation of earlier Sumerian ritual texts, preserves the original name erasures even when translating all other divine names into Akkadian equivalents, demonstrating that the taboo transcended linguistic barriers and represented fundamental religious prohibition rather than mere Sumerian cultural practice. The transition from Sumerian to Akkadian dominance occurred gradually across several centuries as Akkadian-speaking populations gained political control over southern Mesopotamia. The Akkadian Empire, established by Sargon of Akkad around 2300 BC, marked the first major political unification under Akkadian-speaking rulers, though Sumerian continued as a religious and scholarly language for another 1,000 years. This linguistic transition created challenges for religious institutions that needed to maintain ritual continuity while adapting sacred texts to the language spoken by contemporary populations. Tablet Vot 9555, housed in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin, represents a bilingual religious document dating to approximately 2100 BC during the Third Dynasty. The tablet format presents Sumerian text in the left column, with corresponding Akkadian translation in the right column, following standard bilingual text conventions. The document contains ritual instructions for monthly ceremonies to various deities, providing detailed specifications for offerings, timing, and liturgical recitations. The treatment of divine names throughout this bilingual text reveals the systematic application of name prohibition protocols across linguistic boundaries. For standard deities whose names could be freely written and spoken, the tablet provides straightforward translations. The Sumerian name Inanna appears in the Akkadian column as Ishtar. The Sumerian Utu becomes Akkadian Shamash. The Sumerian Nana translates to Akkadian Sin. These direct name translations demonstrate the translator's competence and their willingness to render divine names into the new language when no prohibition applied. However, when the Sumerian text reaches sections addressing unnamed entities, the translation pattern shifts dramatically. The Sumerian phrase Numu Bika Nu Dub, which earlier analysis identified as the standard name prohibition formula, appears in the Akkadian column as Shashumshula Izakru. This Akkadian phrase employs the relative pronoun sha meaning whose, or that which, followed by shumshu meaning his name, and the negative verb construction la izakru meaning must not be mentioned or spoken. The grammatical structure creates exactly parallel meaning to the Sumerian original, while adapting the expression to Akkadian linguistic conventions. More significantly, where the Sumerian text contains blank spaces indicating deliberate name erasures, the Akkadian translation preserves these blank spaces rather than attempting to fill them with Akkadian divine names. This preservation of erasures represents a remarkable translation decision. Normal translation practice would either provide equivalent names in the target language or explain why names were absent. The decision to translate blank spaces as blank spaces indicates that the translators understood the erasures as essential elements of the text requiring preservation, rather than as deficiencies requiring correction. The ritual procedures described in Tablet VAT 9555 include offerings to 7 unnamed entities, designated in Sumerian only by numerical ordinals, the first, the second, the third, and so forth. The Akkadian translation maintains this numerical designation system, rendering Sumerian Dingir 1 Kam as Akkadian Ilu Ishtan, meaning first god, and continuing through the complete sequence to Dingir 7 Kam, rendered as Ilu Sebu, meaning seventh god. The use of ordinal numbering in both languages creates parallel designation systems that enable ritual continuity across the linguistic transition, while maintaining the prohibition against recording actual names. The offering specifications demonstrate similar translation approaches. When Sumerian texts specify offerings of particular animal types, grain quantities, or ritual materials for named deities, the Akkadian translations provide straightforward equivalents using standard Akkadian terminology for these materials. However, offerings designated for unnamed entities receive special handling. The Sumerian text describes certain offerings as gifts for those who dwell in sealed darkness, using a phrase that combines spatial imagery with concealment metaphors. The Akkadian translation renders this as Shakin ana asha salmusabtu, meaning placed for those of the sea's dark place, preserving both the spatial and concealment elements while adapting the expression to Akkadian grammatical structures. The liturgical sections of the tablet reveal that verbal formulas used during ceremonies to unnamed entities underwent careful translation to maintain their protective functions. Sumerian incantation formulas employed specific sound patterns and rhythmic structures believed to possess inherent power. Akkadian translators faced the challenge of preserving these sonic properties while rendering the meaning in a different language with distinct phonological characteristics. The solutions employed demonstrate sophisticated understanding of both linguistic systems and ritual requirements. One Sumerian formula employed 7-syllable phrases with strict vowel alternation patterns, creating specific sonic rhythms. The Akkadian translation maintains the 7-syllable structure and approximates the vowel patterns as closely as Akkadian phonology permits, sometimes employing archaic Akkadian vocabulary or unusual grammatical constructions to achieve the required sound patterns. This priority given to sonic properties over grammatical naturalness indicates that translators understood the formula's effectiveness depended partly on their acoustic characteristics rather than solely on their semantic content. The transmission of name prohibition protocols from Sumerian to Akkadian required active institutional coordination to ensure consistent application across the linguistic transition. Evidence for this coordination appears in administrative texts documenting training programs for Akkadian-speaking priests who needed to perform rituals originally developed in Sumerian contexts. Tablet EM 47692 contains records from a temple school at Babylon describing a curriculum for training priests in the silent ceremonies, with explicit instruction in both Sumerian and Akkadian prohibition formulas. The curriculum required students to master Sumerian name prohibition grammar, even though Sumerian was no longer a spoken language, ensuring they could read and understand original ritual texts. Students then learned Akkadian equivalents and practiced translating prohibition formulas between the languages while maintaining theological accuracy. The training program included memorization of extensive lists correlating Sumerian and Akkadian divine names for standard deities, followed by separate instruction on entities whose names appeared in neither language. This pedagogical structure created bilingual competency, specifically adapted to the unique requirements of unnamed entity worship. The persistence of name prohibitions across the Sumerian to Akkadian transition suggests these restrictions derived from theological understanding that transcended cultural or linguistic specifics. If the prohibitions had represented purely Sumerian cultural conventions, the transition to Akkadian dominance might have provided opportunity to relax or abandon these practices as belonging to superseded traditions. Instead, Akkadian religious institutions actively maintained and even strengthened the prohibitions, suggesting they encountered or believed in the same supernatural realities that had originally motivated Sumerian name restrictions. Later linguistic transitions within Mesopotamian history show similar patterns of prohibition preservation. When Aramaic became the common spoken language during the first millennium BC, administrative texts in Aramaic continued to employ circumlocution and numerical designation for unnamed entities, even though Aramaic possessed completely different grammatical structures from both Sumerian and Akkadian. The multi-generational preservation of these practices through successive linguistic changes demonstrates extraordinary institutional commitment to maintaining name prohibitions, regardless of changing cultural and linguistic contexts. The consistency of prohibition practices across linguistic boundaries raises questions about the origins of these restrictions and the entities they concealed. Mesopotamian tradition attributed the establishment of civilization's fundamental religious practices to primordial sages whose knowledge predated normal human cultural development. Mesopotamian tradition describes the Apkallu as 7 primordial sages who brought civilization to humanity during the antediluvian period. Tablet K 2748 states that these sages possessed knowledge of the true names of the 7 watchers who came before the Anunnaki, and that this knowledge was transmitted to selected human priests through elaborate initiation ceremonies. The text describes the Apkallu as establishing protocols for safely referring to these entities without using their actual names. creating the system of circumlocution and symbolic designation that appears throughout Mesopotamian religious literature. This connection suggests the name prohibition originated in humanity's earliest contact with these entities and was maintained through thousands of years of subsequent tradition. The Apkallu tradition represents one of Mesopotamian civilization's most persistent mythological frameworks, appearing in texts spanning over 2,000 years from early Sumerian sources through Neo-Babylonian and Seleucid period documents. The standard tradition identifies 7 Apkallu by name: Uana, Uanaduga, Enmeduga, Enmegalama, Enmebuluga, Anenlilda, and Utwabzu. These beings are described as possessing both human and divine characteristics, typically depicted in Mesopotamian art as figures with human bodies and fish-like lower portions or coverings, suggesting aquatic associations or origins. Tablet K 2748 from the Kuyunjik collection at the British Museum preserves the most explicit connection between the Apkallu and knowledge of unnamed entities. The tablet dates to the Neo-Assyrian period, approximately 7th century BC, but the text explicitly claims to preserve much earlier traditions from before the flood. The document begins with standard invocations establishing its authority through reference to ancient sources, and continues with a narrative describing the Apkallu's role in establishing religious protocols that would govern human-divine interactions throughout subsequent history. The text states that when the Apkallu descended to Earth during the reign of the earliest antediluvian kings, they encountered entities already present who possessed immense power, but whose nature made direct interaction dangerous for humans. The tablet describes these pre-existing entities as the 7 Watchers who came before the Anunnaki, positioning them chronologically and hierarchically prior to the divine beings who would later become the recognized Mesopotamian pantheon. This temporal priority suggests these Watchers represented primordial forces or beings from the earliest phases of cosmic organization. The Apkallu's response to these dangerous pre-existing entities involved establishing systematic protocols that would enable humans to benefit from the Watcher's power while avoiding the harm that direct contact would cause. The text describes the Apkallu as possessing or receiving knowledge of the Watcher's true names, their actual identities in forms that could be spoken and written. However, the Apkallu recognized that transmitting this knowledge to humans would prove catastrophic, as human consciousness could not withstand the cognitive and spiritual effects of processing these names. The solution developed by the Apkallu involved creating the system of circumlocution, numerical designation, and symbolic reference that characterizes all subsequent Mesopotamian treatment of unnamed entities. The text describes this system as a divine gift that allowed humans to participate in relationships with immensely powerful beings while remaining protected from aspects of those beings that exceeded human capacity to process. This framework positions name prohibition not as arbitrary religious restriction, but as practical safety protocol developed by wise beings who understood both the Watcher's nature and human limitations. The transmission of knowledge about unnamed entities from the Apkallu to human priests occurred through elaborate initiation ceremonies that the tablet describes in substantial detail. These initiations required candidates to undergo extensive preparation, including purification procedures lasting months, dietary restrictions that fundamentally altered their physical constitution, and mental training exercises that expanded their cognitive capacity to approach, but not fully comprehend, the forbidden knowledge. The text indicates that even after this intensive preparation, initiates received only partial knowledge, enough to conduct necessary ceremonies and maintain protective protocols, but not enough to understand the Watcher's true nature or speak their actual names. The initiation ceremonies themselves took place in underground chambers specifically constructed for this purpose. The tablet provides architectural specifications for these initiation spaces, including depth requirements of no less than 30 cubits below ground level, ceiling heights of exactly 7 cubits, and wall surfaces that must be completely smooth, without any carved decorations or inscriptions. These specifications match archaeological discoveries of anonymous underground chambers found at various Mesopotamian sites, suggesting the text describes actual physical spaces that were constructed and used for these purposes. The initiation procedure involved progressive revelation of information about the unnamed entities over multiple ceremonial sessions separated by intervals of lunar months. The first initiation revealed only the existence of the entities and their position within cosmic hierarchy. The second initiation taught the numerical designation system and basic protocols for conducting offerings. The third initiation instructed candidates in the grammatical formulas for referring to the entities without naming them. Subsequent initiations progressively revealed more detailed information about the entity's attributes, powers, and the specific ceremonial procedures for safely accessing their assistance. The culminating seventh initiation involved what the text describes as the speaking of the sealed words, not the actual names of the entities, but phonetic approximations or partial name fragments that conveyed some sense of the entity's identities without fully articulating their names. The text indicates that even these partial revelations caused physical and psychological effects in initiates, including temporary sensory distortions, involuntary vocalizations, and altered states of consciousness that persisted for days after the ceremony. These effects required post-initiation recovery procedures, including isolation, specialized dietary treatments, and what the text terms the speaking forth of the fragments, a ritual process where initiates were required to repeatedly vocalize the partial name knowledge they had received until the compulsive effects diminished. The text emphasizes that the Apkallu established strict limitations on how many individuals could possess even this partial knowledge of the entity's identities. Each generation was permitted only 7 fully initiated priests who had completed all 7 initiation levels, maintaining symbolic correspondence with the 7 Apkallu themselves and the 7 unnamed watchers. These 7 initiated priests bore responsibility for training the next generation of candidates, and for conducting the most sensitive ceremonies that required deepest knowledge of unnamed entity protocols. The tablet describes the Apkallu as establishing permanent institutions to preserve and transmit this restricted knowledge across historical time. These institutions operated partly within recognized temple hierarchies, but maintained secret inner circles that conducted the unnamed entity ceremonies and trained initiates outside public view. The text indicates that knowledge of these secret institutions was itself restricted, with most temple personnel and even most priests remaining unaware of the specialized functions occurring within their own religious complexes. The connection between the Apkallu tradition and name prohibition practices provides theological grounding that explains these restrictions as protective measures established by wise primordial beings rather than arbitrary cultural conventions. This framework suggests that the entities concealed behind name prohibitions possessed genuine characteristics that made concealment necessary. They were not simply minor deities elevated through mystery, but powerful beings whose true nature exceeded safe human knowledge. The Apkallu's role as intermediaries who possessed the dangerous knowledge while protecting humans from it created a model for subsequent priestly functions in maintaining unnamed entity worship. The systematic establishment of prohibition protocols by the Apkallu explains the consistency of these practices across the long span of Mesopotamian civilization. If human cultures had developed name prohibitions independently in different cities or periods, significant variation in practices would be expected. Instead, the remarkable uniformity of prohibition grammar, ceremonial protocols, and architectural requirements across different sites and eras suggests adherence to common standards established at civilization's beginning and maintained through continuous institutional transmission. The Apkallu tradition provides a mythological framework accounting for this standardization. The persistence of Apkallu traditions through Mesopotamian history demonstrates ongoing cultural memory of civilization's foundations in knowledge transmitted by non-human teachers. This cultural memory included explicit recognition that some of the most fundamental religious practices derived from sources predating normal human cultural development. The attribution of name prohibition protocols to the Apkallu positions these practices as part of civilization's core inheritance, rather than later innovations, explaining the reverence with which they were maintained despite the practical inconveniences they created. The theological implications extend beyond historical curiosity to fundamental questions about the nature of the entities being concealed. If the Apkallu possessed their actual names, but deliberately chose to conceal them, this suggests the names themselves carried intrinsic power or danger, independent of the entities they designated. This understanding aligns with widespread ancient Near Eastern beliefs in name magic, the idea that knowing and speaking an entity's true name provided power over that entity or created dangerous connection with it. The Apkallu's refusal to transmit the watchers' names even to initiated priests suggests these particular names possessed exceptional power that even controlled usage would prove too dangerous. The visual representation prohibitions extended name concealment into the realm of imagery, creating additional challenges for a culture that relied heavily on iconographic communication. Mesopotamian religious art extensively depicts the recognized pantheon through standardized iconography that makes gods readily identifiable across different media and time periods. Yet certain ritual texts describe offerings and ceremonies to entities whose images could not be created or displayed. Tablet BM 33112 provides instructions for conducting ceremonies before empty pedestals and veiled spaces where the unnamed entity's presence was acknowledged, but their forms could not be represented visually. Archaeological discoveries of temple chambers containing elaborate pedestals and ritual furniture, but absolutely no statuary or relief imagery, support these textual descriptions of imageless worship. Mesopotamian religious iconography developed highly standardized conventions that enabled deity identification through consistent visual attributes. Shamash, the sun god, invariably appears with solar disk symbols and saw blade representations of sun rays. Ishtar displays star symbols, often 8-pointed, and appears in warrior aspect or fertility aspect with distinctive costume elements. Ea or Enki shows association with flowing water streams and often includes fish symbolism. These standardized attributes created visual vocabulary that functioned across different artistic media, from cylinder seals measuring only centimeters to monumental relief sculptures spanning meters. The development of this iconographic system served essential communicative functions in a society where literacy remained restricted to relatively small scribal classes. Visual representations of deities on temple facades, palace walls, and personal seals conveyed religious information to non-literate populations who could recognize divine figures through their standardized attributes, even without reading accompanying inscriptions. The extensive investment in developing and maintaining this visual religious communication system makes its deliberate avoidance for certain entities particularly significant. Tablet BM 33112 from the British Museum collection contains ritual instructions that explicitly prohibit visual representation of specific entities while mandating elaborate ceremonial spaces for their worship. The tablet dates to the Neo-Babylonian period, approximately 6th century BC, and originates from temple archives at Babylon. The text describes annual ceremonies conducted in a temple chamber, designated as the House of the Concealed Ones, providing detailed specifications for preparing the space while absolutely forbidding creation or display of divine images within it. The preparation instructions require construction of 7 pedestals positioned at equal intervals around the chamber's perimeter. Each pedestal must measure exactly 2 cubits in height, with a square platform surface measuring 1 cubit on each side. The pedestals were to be constructed from brick faced with gypsum plaster and painted with specific colours corresponding to a sequence from white through gradations to black. The precision of these specifications and the substantial labour involved in constructing the pedestals demonstrates they served essential ceremonial functions despite supporting no statuary. The text explicitly states that the pedestals must remain empty during ceremonies, with no divine images, symbols, or representations placed upon them. Instead, offerings were arranged on the pedestals themselves, grain, incense, libations, presented directly to the empty space above each platform. The instructions emphasize that priests must not attempt to visualize or imagine the forms of the entities receiving these offerings, suggesting concerns that even mental visualization might prove spiritually dangerous. The chamber preparation included what the text terms veiled spaces, areas of the room that were curtained or screened from direct view. These veiled spaces were positioned behind the pedestals, creating zones where the entity's presence could manifest without becoming visible to human observers. The text specifies that curtains must be constructed from black wool fabric dense enough to prevent any visual perception through the material. The curtains were to be suspended from ceiling beams and arranged to create enclosed areas behind each pedestal, where offerings could be placed without priests seeing into the spaces. The ceremonial procedures described for these imageless worship spaces included distinctive elements designed to acknowledge divine presence without requiring visual confirmation. Priests conducting the ceremonies wore special headdresses with panels extending forward past their faces, limiting peripheral vision and preventing inadvertent glimpses of the veiled spaces. The lighting within the chamber was deliberately minimized, with only a single lamp providing illumination sufficient for priests to navigate the space and arrange offerings without creating bright enough conditions to penetrate the veiled areas. The acoustic elements of the ceremonies compensated for the absence of visual representation through elaborate sound-based acknowledgement of divine presence. The text describes how priests must listen for specific sounds indicating the entity's arrival, changes in air movement causing curtain fabric to rustle, shifts in acoustic resonance within the chamber, or subtle sound patterns that seem to emanate from the veiled spaces. These auditory indicators replaced the visual confirmation that normally accompanied divine presence in Mesopotamian religious practice. Archaeological evidence supporting these textual descriptions of imageless worship appears at multiple Mesopotamian sites. Excavations at Babylon conducted by Robert Calderway between 1899 and 1917 uncovered temple chambers within the Asagula complex that matched the specifications described in tablet BM 33112. One chamber, measuring approximately 15 meters by 10 meters, contained remains of 7 brick pedestals positioned around the room's perimeter, exactly as the text specifies. The pedestals showed traces of different coloured plasters, corresponding to the white to black sequence described in the ritual instructions. Most significantly, the chamber walls and pedestals showed absolutely no traces of statuary mounting points, relief carvings, or painted imagery. The walls had been plastered smooth and painted in neutral earth tones without decorative elements. The ceiling beams retained metal fixtures that appeared designed for suspending fabric curtains, with positioning that would create screened areas behind each pedestal. The complete absence of visual religious imagery in a temple chamber that otherwise displayed all characteristics of active ritual use provides physical confirmation of the imageless worship practices described in the texts. Similar architectural evidence appears at Uruk, where excavations of the Yana temple complex revealed a series of small chambers containing elaborate stone pedestals but no imagery. The pedestals in these chambers were constructed from imported limestone rather than local brick, indicating substantial investment in their preparation. Each pedestal surface showed chemical residues from burned offerings consistent with regular ceremonial use, yet examination of the chambers revealed no statuary fragments, no carved reliefs, no painted figures, nothing that would indicate visual representation of deities. The theological implications of prohibiting visual representation alongside name prohibition suggest concerns extending beyond simple concealment to fundamental questions about the nature of these entities. Mesopotamian religious thought generally assumed that divine beings possessed forms that could be depicted, even if those forms represented symbolic rather than literal physical appearance. The prohibition against creating images suggests either that these entities possessed no stable visual form that could be represented, or that their actual forms carried dangers comparable to the dangers of their names. The contrast between imageless worship of unnamed entities and the image-rich worship of recognized deities created practical and theological challenges. How could worshippers direct their devotion toward beings they could neither name nor visualize? The solutions developed involved shifting focus from the entities themselves to their attributes, effects, and spheres of influence. Ceremonial texts addressing unnamed entities emphasized what they could do rather than what they were, creating functional rather than essential relationships. The empty pedestal imagery created powerful symbolic expressions of absence that paradoxically affirmed presence. The elaborate construction of pedestals designed to remain empty made the emptiness itself a form of representation, not depicting the entities but creating architectural acknowledgement of their existence and importance. This approach to representing the unrepresentable influenced later religious traditions that similarly struggled with depicting transcendent divine realities beyond normal sensory categories. The combined prohibitions against naming and imaging created double concealment that protected these entities' identities more comprehensively than either restriction alone could achieve. Even if information about names leaked from restricted initiatory circles, the absence of visual associations would prevent that knowledge from being broadly disseminated or practically applied. Conversely, even if people somehow visualized these entities, the lack of names would prevent them from invoking or controlling what they had seen. This redundant security system suggests the knowledge being protected carried exceptional significance. The international commercial networks that supplied Mesopotamian temples reveal that knowledge of unnamed entity worship extended beyond Mesopotamia's borders to trading partners who participated in supporting these practices despite their foreign status. Cuneiform tablets from Bahrain, Ancient Dilmun contain commercial records documenting trade in specific materials designated for ceremonies to those beyond naming conducted in Mesopotamian temples. Tablet DL 847 records shipments of rare incense, precious stones, and exotic woods specifically marked for delivery to unnamed temple recipients. The commercial precision of these records, including quantities, quality specifications, and delivery instructions, contrasts sharply with the absolute absence of recipient identification, suggesting that Dilmun merchants participated in supply chains for ceremonies whose beneficiaries' identities were protected even in routine business documentation. The island of Bahrain, known in ancient Mesopotamian texts as Dilmun, occupied a crucial position in maritime trade networks connecting Mesopotamia with the Indus Valley Civilization and the Arabian Peninsula. Dilmun served as entrepot where goods from distant sources were consolidated for shipment to Mesopotamian cities. The island's strategic location and its role as neutral trading ground made it essential to Mesopotamian economic life, particularly for accessing materials unavailable in the resource-poor alluvial plains of southern Iraq. Tablet DL 847, excavated from Bahrain during Danish archaeological expeditions in the 1950s and currently housed in the Bahrain National Museum, represents a commercial invoice documenting a shipment of luxury goods from Dilmun merchants to the Temple of Marduk at Babylon. The tablet dates to approximately 1600 BC, during the period when Babylonian commercial networks reached their greatest geographical extent. The document follows standard Mesopotamian commercial formats, including dated entries, quantities specified in standard measurement units, quality grades for various materials, and prices calculated in silver shekels. The shipment documented in this tablet included frankincense from southern Arabia, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from the Indus region, and teak wood from sources the text designates only as the distant coast. The quantities involved were substantial: 200 kilograms of frankincense, 50 stones of lapis, each weighing approximately 1 kilogram, 300 carnelian beads, and 12 teak logs, each measuring 6 cubits in length. The total value of this shipment, calculated at approximately 500 shekels of silver, represented an enormous commercial transaction requiring sophisticated logistics and substantial capital investment. The critical detail appears in the shipment's consignment notation. Rather than designating delivery to the Marduk temple generally, or to specific named deities within that temple complex, the tablet states the materials are consigned for the silent ceremonies, using the Akkadian phrase Anna Shutati Salmati, literally for the quiet rites. This designation matches exactly the terminology found in Mesopotamian temple administrative texts describing ceremonies to unnamed entities. The commercial document's use of this specialized terminology indicates that Dilmun merchants possess sufficient knowledge of Mesopotamian religious practices to understand the shipment's unusual nature, even while maintaining the prohibition against identifying the ultimate recipients. The quality specifications for materials in this shipment demonstrate that unnamed entity ceremonies demanded premium goods. The frankincense was specified as first grade from the land of Punt, indicating resin from the finest producing regions rather than lower quality material from closer sources. The lapis lazuli required deep blue color without white calcite inclusions, meeting the highest quality standards for this precious stone. The carnelian beads must display uniform color saturation without banding or cloudiness. These quality requirements matched or exceeded specifications for offerings to major named deities, indicating that unnamed entities received the finest materials available. The pricing structure recorded in the tablet reveals that materials designated for silent ceremonies commanded premium prices beyond normal market rates for equivalent quality goods. The frankincense consigned for unnamed ceremonies was priced at 3 shekels per kilogram, approximately 30% higher than the standard rate of 2.3 shekels per kilogram for first-grade frankincense. Similar premium pricing appears for the other materials, suggesting either that sellers understood these goods served special purposes, justifying higher prices, or that the procurement process for ceremonially appropriate materials involved additional costs. The delivery instructions specified in the tablet reveal sophisticated understanding of the ceremonial requirements. The frankincense must be delivered in sealed copper containers that prevented moisture exposure and aroma dispersal during transport. The lapis lazuli stones required individual wrapping in undyed linen cloth before being packed in wooden boxes. The carnelian beads were to be strung on linen cord and sealed in pottery jars. These handling requirements exceeded normal commercial practices and clearly derived from ceremonial protocols communicated from Babylonian temple authorities to Dilmun suppliers. Additional Dilmun commercial texts document ongoing trade relationships specifically dedicated to supplying unnamed entity ceremonies. Tablet DL 923 records a multi-year supply contract between a Dilmun merchant consortium and Babylon Temple Administration for regular shipments of ritual materials. The contract specifies delivery schedules coordinated with the Babylonian ceremonial calendar, indicating that Dilmun merchants understood the timing requirements for different ceremonies and planned their procurement and shipping operations accordingly. The contractual terms included quality assurance provisions, requiring that all materials meet standards verified by designated Babylonian temple inspectors. Materials failing inspection would be rejected with financial penalties assessed against the suppliers. The contract specified that quality standards for materials consigned to silent ceremonies could not be disclosed to third parties, maintaining secrecy about the specific requirements even within commercial documentation. This confidentiality provision suggests that even the material specifications for unnamed entity ceremonies carried sufficient sensitivity to require contractual protection. The geographical scope of supply networks supporting unnamed entity worship extended far beyond Dilmun to encompass sources across the ancient world. The frankincense originated in southern Arabia or the Horn of Africa, requiring trade routes spanning thousands of kilometers. The lapis lazuli came from mines in Afghanistan's Badakhshan region, involving overland trade across the Iranian plateau. The carnelian sourced from the Indus Valley necessitated maritime connections with South Asian civilizations. This extensive geographical reach indicates that maintaining unnamed entity ceremonies required international commercial networks comparable to those supporting major state religious institutions. The participation of foreign merchants in these supply chains raises questions about how much they understood about the ceremonies their goods supported. The commercial documents suggest Dilmun merchants possessed operational knowledge. They knew which materials were required, the quality standards to meet, and the delivery protocols to follow, but were excluded from theological knowledge about the entities receiving the offerings. This separation between operational and theological knowledge enabled practical coordination while maintaining the core prohibition against identifying the unnamed entities. The economic scale of trade dedicated to unnamed entity worship indicates these ceremonies represented major institutional priorities rather than marginal esoteric practices. The substantial capital devoted to procuring premium materials from distant sources, the development of specialized supply chains, and the ongoing multi-generational commercial relationships all demonstrate that Mesopotamian temples allocated significant resources to maintaining unnamed entity ceremonies. This resource allocation reflected theological assessment of these entities' importance and power despite the prohibition against publicly acknowledging their identities. The commercial documentation from Dilmun provides external confirmation of practices described in Mesopotamian religious texts, demonstrating that unnamed entity worship involved concrete material requirements that necessitated international trade relationships. The precision of commercial specifications and the premium prices paid for appropriate materials indicate that these ceremonies demanded exacting standards maintained through careful quality control. The willingness of foreign merchants to participate in these specialized supply chains, while respecting information restrictions, suggests the influence of unnamed entity worship extended beyond Mesopotamian cultural boundaries. The historical development of name prohibition practices reveals unexpected patterns that challenge assumptions about how religious restrictions evolve over time. Comparative analysis of texts from different periods reveals that name prohibition practices became more stringent over time, rather than relaxing as might be expected if they represented primitive superstitions. Early dynastic texts from 2800 BC occasionally include partial names or phonetic hints about unnamed entities, while later Babylonian texts from the first millennium BCE employ increasingly elaborate circumlocution with absolutely no identifying information. Tablet BM 92468 from the Seleucid period describes rituals to the nameless ones using only astronomical coordinates, numerical designations, and temporal markers, suggesting that as Mesopotamian civilization developed greater textual sophistication, the prohibition against naming these entities intensified proportionally. The conventional expectation for religious restrictions suggests they should weaken over time as civilizations become more rational and less superstitious. Ancient taboos often relax as societies develop scientific understanding that demystifies previously feared phenomena. Yet the Mesopotamian name prohibitions demonstrate precisely opposite trajectory, becoming more comprehensive and more strictly enforced as civilization advanced. This counterintuitive pattern demands explanation that accounts for why increasing sophistication led to increasing restriction rather than decreasing superstition. Early dynastic texts from approximately 2800 BC, the earliest period from which substantial cuneiform archives survive, show relatively less rigorous application of name prohibitions compared to later periods. Tablet excavated from Shurapak dating to this early period contains a ritual text that includes what appears to be partial phonetic rendering of an unnamed entity's name. The text employs standard name prohibition grammar, indicating the entity belongs to the unnamed category, yet includes a syllabic sequence that might represent the first portion of the actual name before trailing off into circumlocution. The phonetic sequence reads Se, Emi, Na, followed by the phrase whose completion brings darkness, suggesting the scribe began writing the actual name before stopping and reverting to prohibition language. This pattern appears in several early dynastic texts, indicating that during this period, scribal practice sometimes included partial name disclosure, even while maintaining the prohibition against complete naming. The inconsistency of application suggests that either the prohibition protocols were still being standardized, or that enforcement was less rigorous during civilization's earlier phases. Old Akkadian texts from the Sargonic period, approximately 2300 BC, show tightening of prohibition practices compared to early dynastic sources. Texts from this period eliminate the partial phonetic renderings found in earlier documents, employing only circumlocution and numerical designation with no hints toward actual names. Tablet from Nippur, dating to the reign of Naram-Sin, demonstrates this stricter approach through ritual instructions that repeatedly designate unnamed entities only as the seven who dwell beyond speech, without including any phonetic elements that might suggest their actual identities. The Old Babylonian period, approximately 2000 to 1600 BC, produced extensive religious literature including numerous texts addressing unnamed entities. Comparative analysis of these texts reveals progressive elaboration of circumlocution techniques that created increasingly complex descriptive formulas while moving further from any direct name references. Early Old Babylonian texts employ relatively simple circumlocutions, like those who must not be named, or the silent ones. Later Old Babylonian texts develop compound descriptive phrases like those whose true forms bring madness, whose names bring dissolution, whose presence brings healing, creating multi-clause formulations that describe attributes and effects while absolutely avoiding naming. Middle Babylonian and Middle Assyrian texts from the 2nd millennium BC continue this trend toward more elaborate circumlocution. Tablet from Assur dating to approximately 1300 BC contains a ritual text that designates unnamed entities through a complex formula combining spatial location, astronomical association, numerical position, and temporal references without including anything approaching a proper name. The formula reads those who dwell beneath the 7 steps, who rise with the stars of the winter dark, who receive offerings at the 3rd watch, being the 4th and 5th of the silent assembly. This layered designation system enables precise identification for ritual purposes while maintaining absolute prohibition against actual naming. Neo-Assyrian and Neo-Babylonian texts from the 1st millennium BC demonstrate the most rigorous prohibition practices in Mesopotamian history. These late texts eliminate even the relatively mild descriptive epithets found in earlier sources, replacing them with pure numerical, spatial, and astronomical designations devoid of any characterological description. Tablet K 4729 from Nineveh, dating to the 7th century BC, describes a ceremony using only the designation the 3rd position of the sealed ones when the Red Wanderer stands in the House of the Bull, using planetary positions and numerical ordering as the sole identification method. The Seleucid period, representing the final phase of cuneiform literacy during the last centuries BC, produced the most elaborately restrictive texts regarding unnamed entities. Tablet BM 92468, dating to approximately 200 BC, contains ritual instructions that avoid all descriptive language and employ only mathematical coordinates for identification. The text designates unnamed entities through combinations of astronomical coordinates, calendar positions, and geometric measurements within ritual spaces, creating pure quantitative designation systems completely divorced from linguistic naming. The ritual described in this Seleucid tablet specifies offerings to be made to the entity, designated by the coordinates 14 degrees past the spring point in the pathway of the sun, at the hour when shadow lengths equal 3 times object height, in the position 42 cubits beneath the northern foundation point of the sanctuary. This coordinate system enables absolute precision in identifying which entity receives the offering, while providing zero information about the entity's characteristics, nature, or identity beyond its position in multiple reference frameworks. The progressive development from partial phonetic hints in early dynastic texts to pure coordinate systems in Seleucid texts represents systematic movement toward more complete concealment achieved through increasingly sophisticated designation methods. This trajectory correlates directly with the increasing textual and mathematical sophistication of Mesopotamian civilization. As scribes developed more advanced tools for precise designation without naming, they applied those tools to create more comprehensive concealment of unnamed entities' identities. This correlation between increasing sophistication and increasing restriction suggests several interpretive possibilities. The restrictions may have intensified because advancing knowledge revealed greater dangers associated with the entities, leading to more stringent protective measures. Alternatively, the development of more sophisticated concealment techniques may have enabled more complete implementation of prohibitions that earlier technological limitations prevented from being fully realized. Another possibility suggests that the entities themselves or their human representatives demanded increasing secrecy as historical conditions changed. The consistency of this developmental trajectory across the 3,000-year span of cuneiform literacy indicates the trend reflected deliberate policy rather than random variation. Multiple generations of priests and scribes chose to strengthen rather than relax prohibitions despite the practical inconveniences these restrictions created. This sustained commitment to intensifying concealment practices suggests ongoing perceived necessity for maintaining and even enhancing protection against the dangers associated with these entities' names. The late Babylonian and Seleucid intensification of prohibitions occurred during periods when Mesopotamian civilization faced increasing foreign cultural influence from Persian, Greek, and eventually Roman sources. The strengthening of traditional Mesopotamian prohibition practices during this period of external cultural pressure may reflect conservative impulses to preserve authentic traditions against foreign contamination. However, the specific focus on unnamed entity prohibitions rather than on religious practices generally suggests motivations beyond simple cultural conservatism. The final cuneiform texts addressing unnamed entities, produced during the last centuries of cuneiform literacy, when knowledge of this writing system had become extremely restricted, demonstrate determination to preserve prohibition protocols even as the broader cuneiform tradition was dying. The investment of scarce scholarly resources in maintaining these practices during cuneiform's final phase indicates they retained significance for the remaining cuneiform literateurs who chose to preserve unnamed entity protocols rather than other aspects of Mesopotamian religious tradition. The historical development from relatively relaxed early dynastic practices to hyper-restrictive Seleucid protocols demonstrates that Mesopotamian civilization's 3,000-year engagement with unnamed entities produced increasing rather than decreasing concern about the dangers of identification. This pattern suggests that accumulated historical experience reinforced rather than undermined the original prohibition rationale, indicating these were not arbitrary superstitions that would naturally fade with advancing knowledge but protective measures whose necessity became more apparent with increased understanding. The response of foreign cultures to Mesopotamian name prohibition practices provides crucial evidence about whether these restrictions reflected purely cultural conventions or represented responses to phenomena that transcended cultural boundaries. When the Kassites conquered Babylon around 1595 BC and established their own dynasty, their initial temple records attempted to name all divine recipients of royal offerings using their own linguistic conventions. Within 3 generations, however, Kassite administrative texts adopted the Babylonian name prohibition protocols, describing certain temple ceremonies using the established circumlocutions, despite Kassite being a language isolate unrelated to either Sumerian or Akkadian. This rapid adoption by a foreign culture suggests they encountered actual phenomena or received compelling religious instruction that convinced them to maintain the name taboo, despite their cultural independence from Mesopotamian traditions. The Kassite conquest of Babylon occurred during a period of widespread political upheaval across the ancient Near East following the collapse of the Old Babylonian dynasty. The Kassites, whose ethnic and linguistic origins remain debated among scholars, established control over Babylonia and maintained their dynasty for over 4 centuries, making them one of the longest ruling powers in Mesopotamian history. Despite their political and military success, the Kassites remained culturally distinct from the Babylonian populations they governed, maintaining their own language, religious traditions, and administrative practices alongside adopted Mesopotamian conventions. The earliest Kassite administrative texts from the initial decades following their conquest show attempts to impose Kassite religious frameworks onto Babylonian temple institutions. Tablet KS 73 from the reign of Agum II, approximately 1590 to 1570 BC, records royal offerings to Babylonian temples using Kassite divine names and religious terminology. The text lists offerings to Babylonian deities, but refers to them using Kassite linguistic forms and occasionally substitutes Kassite divine names for Babylonian equivalents where the Kassites identified functional correspondences between the pantheons. However, these early Kassite texts reveal confusion when addressing temple ceremonies that lacked identifiable divine recipients. The scribes initially left blank spaces in their records where Babylonian sources would have employed circumlocution formulas for unnamed entities, apparently uncertain how to handle these anomalous ceremonies within their own record-keeping systems. Tablet KS 91 from approximately 1580 BC shows a scribe's notation in the margin, questioning why certain major temple ceremonies provided no divine names, suggesting the Kassite administrators initially interpreted the absence as incomplete information rather than deliberate prohibition. The transition in Kassite practice appears in temple records from the reign of Bernaburush I, approximately 1530 to 1510 BC, representing the second generation of Kassite rule. Tablet KS 247 from this period shows the first Kassite adoption of Babylonian circumlocution formulas, employing the phrase "those beyond naming" rendered into Kassite linguistic structures. The text maintains Kassite grammatical forms, but incorporates the conceptual framework of name prohibition, indicating that Kassite administrators had come to understand these were not missing names, but deliberately unnamed recipients. By the third Kassite generation during the reign of Kashtiliash III, approximately 1470 to 1460 BC, Kassite temple administrative texts fully integrated Babylonian name prohibition protocols using both borrowed Babylonian terminology and newly developed Kassite circumlocution formulas. Tablet KS 412 demonstrates this mature integration through its description of ceremonies to the 7 who dwell in sealed darkness, employing a Kassite grammatical construction that precisely mirrors the Babylonian prohibition formula while expressing it in Kassite linguistic forms. The rapidity of this adoption, occurring within approximately 75 years from initial conquest to full integration of prohibition practices, suggests the Kassites encountered compelling reasons to maintain these restrictions despite their foreign origin and cultural independence. Several factors may explain this swift adoption. The Kassite rulers may have experienced direct phenomena during temple ceremonies that convinced them of genuine supernatural realities, requiring the name prohibitions. Babylonian priests may have provided theological instruction that persuaded Kassite administrators of the dangers involved. Alternatively, political considerations regarding maintaining legitimacy among Babylonian populations may have motivated adoption of established religious practices. The documentary evidence suggests a combination of these factors. Kassite royal inscriptions from the mid-dynasty period reference consultation with Babylonian priests regarding proper conduct of ancient ceremonies, indicating that Kassite rulers actively sought instruction in Mesopotamian religious traditions. Tablet KS 368 contains a letter from a Kassite king to the chief priest of Marduk's temple, requesting detailed explanation of the silent ceremonies and their proper performance, demonstrating royal interest in understanding rather than simply continuing these practices, More intriguingly, Kassite medical texts from the later dynasty period describe illnesses affecting Kassite nobles who had improperly participated in ceremonies to unnamed entities. Tablet Bam, Kassite Supplement 47 Catalogues, Symptoms Suffered by a Kassite Prince, following his unauthorized attempt to learn the names of the 7 Silent Ones, describing progressive mental deterioration that required extensive ritual treatments. The specificity of these medical accounts and their integration into Kassite healthcare practices suggests the Kassites encountered actual negative consequences from improper interaction with unnamed entities, providing experiential motivation for adopting protective protocols. The linguistic evidence proves particularly significant. Kassite is a language isolate with no demonstrated relationship to Sumerian, Akkadian, or any other known language family. The fact that Kassite scribes developed native Kassite circumlocution formulas rather than simply borrowing Babylonian phrases indicates they understood the prohibition as a theological principle that needed expression in their own language rather than as a foreign ritual formula to be mechanically repeated. This translation effort demonstrates intellectual engagement with the underlying concepts rather than superficial adoption of foreign practices. The Kassite contribution to name prohibition practices included innovations that influenced subsequent Mesopotamian tradition. Kassite texts introduced the concept of degree classifications for unnamed entities, distinguishing between those whose names must never be spoken under any circumstances and those whose names could be revealed to highest initiates under specific conditions. This classification system appears in later Babylonian texts, and may represent Kassite theological development applied to inherited Mesopotamian traditions. The Kassite experience demonstrates that name prohibition practices survived transfer to a culturally and linguistically distinct population that had no ancestral connection to Sumerian or Akkadian traditions. This successful transfer argues against interpreting the prohibitions as culturally specific conventions that would lose meaning outside their original context. Instead, the Kassite adoption suggests these practices addressed realities that transcended cultural boundaries and proved convincing even to foreign rulers with independent religious traditions. The medical literature provides perhaps the most concrete evidence that name prohibitions address genuine dangers rather than symbolic or conventional restrictions. Babylonian diagnostic texts describe specific illnesses caused by improper invocation of unnamed entities or accidental utterance of their forbidden names. Tablet Bam, 452 catalogue symptoms, including madness that comes from speaking the 7 names, characterized by sensory distortions, compulsive speech patterns, and progressive mental deterioration. The text provides detailed treatments involving purification rituals, protective amulets, and ceremonies specifically designed to counteract the spiritual contamination caused by name-speaking. The medical precision of these descriptions and their consistency across multiple independent diagnostic texts suggests they documented actual observed conditions rather than purely mythological ailments. Tablet Bam 452 belongs to the extensive Babylonian medical compendium known as the Diagnostic Handbook, a systematic collection of medical texts that organize disease descriptions, diagnostic procedures, and treatment protocols. The tablet dates to approximately 800 BC during the Neo-Assyrian period, but preserves medical knowledge accumulated over many previous centuries. The text follows standard Mesopotamian medical format, beginning with symptom descriptions, progressing through diagnostic procedures, and concluding with treatment recommendations. The section addressing madness from speaking forbidden names opens with a diagnostic formula. If a man's mind becomes confused and he speaks words he does not intend, if he sees things that are not present and hears voices without source, and if he previously attempted to learn or speak the names of the 7 Silent Ones, this is the hand of the nameless affliction. This diagnostic structure matches precisely the format used throughout Mesopotamian medical literature for identifying diseases through symptom patterns and causal history, treating name-speaking madness as a medical condition comparable to any other illness. The symptom descriptions demonstrate remarkable clinical precision. The text specifies that initial symptoms appear within 3 to 7 days following improper name-speaking, beginning with auditory distortions where normal sounds seem distant or distorted, and unfamiliar sounds seem preternaturally clear. Visual disturbances follow, including peripheral vision phenomena where the patient perceives movement or shapes at the edges of their visual field that disappear when directly observed. The sensory symptoms progress to include tactile hallucinations described as feelings of pressure or touch without physical cause. The compulsive speech patterns characteristic of this condition receive detailed description. Affected individuals begin speaking in syllables or word fragments that they report feeling compelled to vocalize without conscious intent. The text notes that these compulsive utterances often include phonetic elements, similar to the forbidden names the patient had attempted to learn, suggesting that partial knowledge of the names created ongoing mental contamination that manifested through involuntary vocalization. The compulsion intensifies over time, with patients eventually unable to suppress the utterances even during sleep, creating exhaustion that compounds the condition's severity. The progressive mental deterioration described in the text includes specific cognitive impairments. Patients lose ability to maintain attention on tasks, experience memory disruptions particularly affecting recent events, while older memories remain intact, and develop difficulties in spatial orientation causing them to become lost in familiar locations. The text emphasizes that these cognitive symptoms distinguish name-speaking madness from other mental disorders, providing differential diagnostic criteria that enable physicians to identify the specific condition. The treatment protocols specified for name-speaking madness demonstrate the integration of medical and ritual approaches characteristic of Mesopotamian healthcare. The first treatment phase involves physical isolation of the patient in a specially prepared chamber to prevent the contamination from spreading to others. The isolation chamber must be located at least 100 cubits from normal habitation, constructed with walls thick enough to muffle the patient's compulsive vocalizations, and provisioned with supplies to support both patient and attendants for the duration of treatment. Purification procedures constitute the treatment's second phase, involving ritual bathing of the patient 3 times daily in water that has been blessed through specific incantations and mixed with mineral salts, aromatic herbs, and substances believed to possess purifying properties. The text provides exact recipes for these purification baths, specifying quantities of each ingredient and the sequences for their addition to the water. The purification baths continue for minimum 14 days, or until the compulsive speech symptoms begin diminishing, whichever period proves longer. The protective amulet creation represents the treatment's third component. The text describes construction of specialized amulets from specific materials including copper, carnelian, and hematite, arranged in geometric patterns and inscribed with protective formulas. These amulets were to be worn continuously by the patient and replaced monthly until complete recovery occurred. The inscriptions on the amulets employ the same circumlocution formulas used in temple ceremonies, creating verbal barriers between the patient and the unnamed entities whose names had caused the contamination. The ceremonial component of treatment involves elaborate rituals conducted by specialized priests, trained in dealing with name-speaking contamination. These ceremonies occur during specific lunar phases when the moon is waning, believed to reduce the strength of supernatural influences. The rituals include offerings made on the patient's behalf to protective deities, invocations of divine assistance in breaking the contamination, and counter-incantations designed to neutralize the effects of the improperly spoken names. The recovery prognosis described in the text depends on several factors, including how completely the forbidden names were uttered, how long symptoms persisted before treatment began, and the patient's overall physical and spiritual condition. The text notes that patients who spoke only partial name fragments and received immediate treatment typically recovered fully within 2 to 3 lunar months. Those who had spoken complete names or delayed treatment faced longer recovery periods and risked permanent cognitive impairment even with optimal treatment. Additional Babylonian medical texts corroborate these descriptions of name-speaking madness, providing independent confirmation of the condition's characteristics and treatments. Tablet BAM 217 describes similar symptoms in a case history format, detailing the illness progression in a specific patient who had accidentally overheard forbidden names during temple ceremonies. The case history notes the patient's gradual recovery following treatment protocols matching those described in Tablet BAM 452. Providing evidence that these treatments were actually implemented rather than representing purely theoretical medical knowledge. The consistency of symptom descriptions across multiple independent medical texts spanning several centuries suggests Mesopotamian physicians observed and documented actual medical conditions associated with improper exposure to forbidden names. The precision of the clinical descriptions, the specificity of the differential diagnostic criteria, and the detailed treatment protocols all indicate these texts describe real phenomena encountered in medical practice rather than hypothetical or mythological illnesses. The integration of name-speaking madness into mainstream Babylonian medical literature, alongside treatments for injuries, infections, and other clearly physical conditions, demonstrates that Mesopotamian physicians considered this a genuine medical problem requiring professional intervention. The allocation of substantial medical resources to documenting and treating this condition indicates it occurred with sufficient frequency to warrant systematic medical attention. The medical documentation of harmful effects from speaking forbidden names provides concrete support for the prohibition's practical rationale. If speaking these names reliably produced observable medical symptoms, the prohibition against naming unnamed entities served clear protective functions rather than representing arbitrary religious convention. The medical texts transform the name prohibition from abstract theological restriction into practical public health measure designed to prevent documented harm. The encounter between Mesopotamian religious traditions and the Persian Empire's Zoroastrian system provides additional external perspective on name prohibition practices. When Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon in 539 BC, Persian administrators encountered Mesopotamian religious practices including ceremonies to unnamed entities. Tablet PF 1692 from the Persepolis Fortification Archive records Persian royal authorization for continuing the ancient silent ceremonies with allocated resources but explicit prohibitions against Persian priests learning the actual identities of the recipients. This external documentation by a conquering power with its own established religious system provides independent confirmation that the name prohibition represented genuine religious practice rather than literary convention or scribal error. The Persian conquest of Babylon marked a major transition in Mesopotamian political history, bringing the region under control of the Achaemenid Empire, whose rulers practiced Zoroastrianism, a religious system substantially different from Mesopotamian polytheism. The Persians generally pursued tolerant policies toward conquered peoples' religions, allowing continued practice of local traditions while integrating these territories into the imperial administrative structure. However, Persian authorities maintained oversight of major temple activities to ensure they did not threaten imperial interests. Tablet PF 1692 from the Persepolis Fortification Archive dates to the reign of Darius I, approximately 515 BC, placing it approximately 25 years after Cyrus's initial conquest. The tablet belongs to an extensive archive of administrative documents recording resource allocations, personnel assignments, and authorization of activities throughout the Persian Empire. The Fortification Archive primarily documents practical administrative matters rather than religious theology, making its references to unnamed entity ceremonies particularly significant as evidence of actual institutional practices. The tablet format follows Persian administrative conventions written in Elamite cuneiform, which served as the primary administrative language for the Persian heartland, despite Aramaic functioning as the empire's diplomatic language. The document begins with standard dating formulas referencing the regnal year of Darius, and continues with authorization statements attributed to royal authority. The specific authorization relevant to unnamed entities reads, "By order of the king, the ancient silent ceremonies of the House of Marduk shall continue according to their established customs, with provisions allocated as specified. Those ceremonies whose recipients dwell beyond naming shall be conducted by the Babylonian priests according to their tradition, but the names that are concealed shall not be revealed to Persian officials or priests." This authorization demonstrates several significant elements. First, it confirms that ceremonies to unnamed entities constituted recognized institutional practices important enough to require explicit royal authorization during the administrative integration of Babylon into the Persian Empire. Second, it shows that Persian administrators understood these were not simply unnamed because records had been lost, but represented deliberately unnamed recipients whose identities were intentionally concealed. Third, it reveals that Persian authorities chose to respect the name prohibition, even though they possessed the political power to demand full disclosure. The resource allocation specified in the tablet demonstrates substantial Persian support for unnamed entity ceremonies. The document authorizes annual provisions including 1,000 measures of barley, 500 measures of dates, 200 sheep, 50 measures of sesame oil, and various quantities of aromatic substances and precious materials. These quantities represent significant economic commitment, indicating that Persian administrators recognized these ceremonies as major institutional activities rather than minor peripheral practices. The explicit prohibition against Persian priests learning the concealed names suggests active Persian interest in understanding Babylonian religious practices, combined with deliberate decision to respect the name restrictions. The phrasing implies that Persian authorities had requested or considered requesting disclosure of the names, but ultimately decided against requiring revelation. This restraint by a conquering power that could have demanded information indicates the Persians found compelling reasons to maintain the prohibition, despite their administrative interest in understanding activities they were funding. Several factors may explain Persian willingness to continue supporting ceremonies whose recipients they could not identify. Zoroastrian theology included concepts of powerful spiritual entities whose names carried power, making Persian religious leaders potentially sympathetic to arguments about dangers of name-speaking. Persian administrative pragmatism favored maintaining functional systems rather than disrupting them through religious interference, especially in newly conquered territories where local populations might resist heavy-handed religious impositions. Additionally, Babylonian priests may have provided explanations about the dangers of these names that persuaded Persian administrators that revelation would create genuine problems. Additional tablets from the Persepolis archive reference ongoing Persian oversight of Babylonian unnamed entity ceremonies throughout the Achaemenid period. Tablet PF 2143 from approximately 490. BC records Persian authorization for construction of new underground ceremonial chambers beneath Babylon temples specifically designated for the silent rites. The Persian willingness to fund new construction for these ceremonies demonstrates sustained commitment to supporting practices they did not fully understand, suggesting accumulated experience had convinced them of their importance or necessary nature. Persian period Babylonian temple archives contain references to communications between Babylonian priests and Persian officials regarding the unnamed ceremonies. Tablet BM 73,594 preserves a letter from the chief priest of the Asagala temple to a Persian satrap explaining why certain ceremony details could not be disclosed even to imperial authorities. The letter emphasizes the protective nature of the prohibitions, arguing that revealing the names would endanger not only the priests but also the Persian officials who learned them. The satrap's response, preserved in a subsequent document, accepts this explanation and reaffirms that Persian authorities would not require disclosure. The Persian experience with Mesopotamian name prohibitions represents a crucial test case for evaluating whether these practices reflected genuine religious realities or merely cultural conventions. The Persians approached Babylon as foreign conquerors with independent religious traditions and no cultural obligation to accept Mesopotamian theological claims. Their decision to not only permit but actively support ceremonies to unnamed entities whose identities they were prohibited from learning suggests they found the practices convincing despite their external perspective. The Persian documentation provides independent confirmation from non-Mesopotamian sources that unnamed entity worship constituted actual institutional practice rather than literary fiction or scribal error. Persian administrators dealing with practical resource allocation and institutional oversight would have investigated the purposes of activities they were funding. Their continued support indicates they received satisfactory explanations, even if those explanations did not include revelation of the actual names being concealed. The astronomical sophistication applied to determining safe timing for unnamed entity ceremonies reveals the integration of advanced scientific knowledge with religious practice. Babylonian astronomical texts describe specific celestial configurations when rituals to the unnamed entities could be safely conducted. Tablet K 3454 provides calculations for determining optimal ritual timing based on planetary positions, lunar phases, and stellar alignments that create openings in the barriers between naming and being. The mathematical precision of these calculations demonstrates sophisticated astronomical knowledge applied to determining windows of time when the spiritual dangers associated with these entities were minimized, suggesting the name prohibition reflected practical safety concerns rather than arbitrary religious convention. Tablet K 3454 from the Kuyunjik collection at the British Museum represents an astronomical procedure text dating to the Neo-Assyrian period, approximately 7th century BC. The document belongs to a larger category of Babylonian astronomical texts that provided calculation methods for predicting celestial phenomena and determining appropriate timing for various activities, including religious ceremonies, agricultural operations, and political decisions. The integration of unnamed entity ceremony timing within this technical astronomical literature demonstrates that determining safe approach, windows for these beings, required the same mathematical sophistication applied to eclipse prediction and planetary position calculation. The text opens with a statement of purpose. To determine the times when the barriers thin and approach to the 7 silent ones becomes possible without bringing forth the madness. This opening establishes that the astronomical calculations serve protective functions, identifying time periods when interaction with unnamed entities carried reduced risk. The reference to madness connects directly to the medical text describing mental deterioration from improper exposure to these entities, indicating that timing calculations aim to prevent documented harmful effects. The primary calculation method involves determining conjunctions between specific planets and particular stellar configurations associated with unnamed entities. The text provides step-by-step procedures for calculating when Jupiter, identified as the white star, reaches positions within specific stellar regions designated as dwelling places of the Silent Ones. The calculations account for Jupiter's synodic period of approximately 399 days and its movement through the zodiacal constellations, requiring mathematical techniques for predicting planetary positions relative to fixed star backgrounds. The lunar component of the timing calculations involves identifying specific moon phases when ceremonies could proceed safely. The text specifies that rituals must occur during periods of minimal lunar illumination, preferably during the 3 days surrounding new moon when the night sky is darkest. However, the calculations include important exceptions for certain unnamed entities who are associated with lunar phenomena and require instead ceremonies during full moon periods. The text provides mathematical methods for calculating exact times of new and full moon events, employing lunar month calculations that demonstrate understanding of the lunar cycle's 29.5-day average duration. The stellar alignment requirements add additional complexity to the timing calculations. The text specifies that certain ceremonies require simultaneous alignment of multiple stellar configurations, designated as markers for different silent ones. The calculations must determine when these independent stellar positions achieve specified geometric relationships, requiring coordinate system mathematics that translate between different celestial reference frames. The precision demanded by these calculations approaches the limits of naked eye observational capabilities, suggesting that Babylonian astronomers invested substantial effort in refining measurements specifically for unnamed entity ceremony timing. The concept of openings in the barriers between naming and being introduces a sophisticated theological framework for understanding the temporal variations in unnamed entity accessibility. The text describes these barriers as cosmic structures that normally prevent direct human interaction with these powerful beings, protecting humans from exposure they cannot safely process. However, specific astronomical configurations temporarily thin or open these barriers, creating time windows when properly prepared priests can conduct ceremonies with reduced risk. The mathematical methods employed for calculating barrier opening times combine observational astronomy with theoretical prediction. The text includes tables of previous barrier opening events with their corresponding astronomical configurations, enabling astronomers to identify patterns and predict future occurrences. These historical tables span multiple decades of observations, indicating long-term institutional programs dedicated to monitoring and predicting optimal ceremony times. The calculation procedures account for geographical variations in observational conditions, recognizing that stellar and planetary positions appear different when observed from different terrestrial locations. The text provides correction factors that adjust calculations for Babylon's specific latitude, enabling predictions accurate for local observational conditions. This geographical sophistication demonstrates understanding that astronomical phenomena are position-dependent, requiring location-specific calculations for practical applications. The precision requirements specified in the text reveal the seriousness with which Babylonian priests approached ceremony timing. The calculations must achieve accuracy within approximately 1 hour for determining optimal ritual commencement times, requiring astronomical measurements and mathematical calculations far exceeding the precision needed for basic calendar functions. The text emphasizes that conducting ceremonies outside the calculated safe windows creates substantial dangers, reinforcing the protective purpose of these astronomical calculations. Additional astronomical texts corroborate the timing calculation methods described in Tablet K 3454. Tablet BM 35788 provides alternative calculation procedures yielding identical results through different mathematical approaches, confirming that multiple independent astronomical traditions produce consistent timing predictions for unnamed entity ceremonies. This convergence of independent methods on identical results validates the calculation techniques and demonstrates their reliability. The integration of advanced astronomical calculations into unnamed entity worship transforms the name prohibition from simple taboo into component of a comprehensive safety system. The prohibition against naming provided one protective layer, while timing restrictions added temporal protection that limited ceremonial access to specific astronomical windows when interactions carried minimal risk. This multi-layered protective approach suggests genuine concerns about dangers that required both identification concealment and temporal restrictions to manage safely. The astronomical texts present unnamed entity ceremonies as requiring scientific knowledge comparable to any technical enterprise, employing mathematics, observational data, and predictive calculations to determine safe operating parameters. This scientific approach to managing supernatural interactions indicates that Mesopotamian priests understood these entities as real phenomena requiring careful management rather than symbolic religious concepts requiring only ritual performance. The global distribution of name prohibition practices across geographically separated cultures provides crucial context for evaluating whether Mesopotamian traditions represented unique local developments or reflected universal patterns in human religious experience. Similar name prohibition practices appear in geographically separated cultures, including ancient Egypt, Vedic India, and pre-Columbian Mesoamerica. Hebrew tradition prohibits writing the true name of God, employing circumlocutions like Adonai or Hashem. Hindu texts describe entities whose true names cause spiritual contamination if spoken. Aztec sources reference gods whose names were replaced with epithets. The global distribution of these parallel practices suggests either independent development of name taboos in response to universal religious experiences, or transmission of these practices through ancient cultural networks that recognize certain entities as requiring name protection. The Hebrew prohibition against writing or speaking the divine name represents one of the most widely known examples of name taboo outside Mesopotamian tradition. Jewish practice replaces the tetragrammaton YHWH with spoken substitutes including Adonai meaning Lord or Hashem meaning the name, creating linguistic circumlocution comparable to Mesopotamian formulas. The prohibition extends beyond casual usage to include restrictions on writing the name, with scribes employing special procedures when copying sacred texts containing the tetragrammaton and prohibiting erasure or destruction of any document bearing the divine name. The theological rationale for Hebrew name prohibition shares conceptual elements with Mesopotamian traditions while developing distinct theological frameworks. Hebrew sources emphasize the name's holiness and power, arguing that casual use would diminish its sacred character, or that speaking the name incorrectly might invoke divine presence inappropriately. The Talmud preserves traditions suggesting that knowledge of the name's proper pronunciation provided access to divine power, requiring restriction to prevent misuse. These concerns about power and proper usage parallel Mesopotamian emphasis on dangers from improper naming. The historical relationship between Hebrew and Mesopotamian name prohibition practices remains debated. The Jewish population's exile in Babylon during the 6th century BC created direct contact with Mesopotamian religious traditions that may have influenced Jewish practices. However, biblical texts predating the exile contain name restrictions, suggesting Hebrew traditions developed independently or derived from earlier cultural contacts predating documented Babylonian interaction. The linguistic and theological differences between Hebrew and Mesopotamian prohibition systems support independent development rather than simple borrowing. Hindu religious literature describes entities designated as those whose names burn the tongue or beings whose true names destroy the speaker, employing imagery of physical harm from name-speaking comparable to Mesopotamian medical descriptions. The Vedic texts reference divine beings approached only through euphemisms and epithets, with actual names reserved for highest initiates who undergo extensive preparation before receiving revelation. The Upanishads describe elaborate purification requirements for those who would learn certain divine names, creating initiatory systems parallel to Mesopotamian temple priesthood training. The Hindu concept of mantra power provides theological framework for understanding name restrictions, positing that sacred sounds, including divine names, possess intrinsic power independent of their semantic meaning. Improper pronunciation or unauthorized utterance of powerful mantras can cause harm to the speaker or unintended effects in the world, necessitating restrictions that protect both individuals and cosmic order. This understanding of names as possessing inherent power rather than serving as arbitrary labels matches Mesopotamian theological frameworks underlying their prohibition systems. The geographical and temporal distance separating Vedic Indian traditions from Mesopotamian civilizations complicates questions of cultural transmission versus independent development. The Indus Valley Civilization maintained trade contacts with Mesopotamia during the 3rd millennium BC, providing potential transmission routes for religious concepts. However, the earliest Vedic texts postdate this contact period, and the linguistic differences between Sanskrit name prohibition formulas and Mesopotamian versions suggest independent development of similar concepts rather than direct borrowing. Pre-Columbian Mesoamerican cultures, including the Aztec and Maya, employed name substitution systems for certain deities that parallel Old World prohibition practices despite the geographical isolation of the Americas. Aztec sources refer to Tezcatlipoca as the Lord of the Smoking Mirror, or the enemy, rather than employing his actual name in many contexts. Mayan hieroglyphic texts employ euphemistic designations for certain deities, creating circumlocution systems that avoid direct naming. The ritual calendars governing ceremonial timing for these entities demonstrate astronomical sophistication comparable to Babylonian calculation methods. The complete geographical isolation of Mesoamerican civilizations from Old World cultures until European contact in the 15th century AD eliminates the possibility of direct cultural transmission of name prohibition practices. The independent development of similar systems in Mesoamerica suggests these practices may emerge as natural human responses to specific types of religious experiences rather than representing culturally specific conventions requiring transmission. If geographically isolated populations independently developed comparable name prohibitions, this pattern implies universal human tendencies or encounters with universal phenomena. The comparative analysis reveals both similarities and differences across these global name prohibition traditions. The similarities include recognition that certain entities' names possess inherent power, use of circumlocution and euphemism to enable reference without naming, restriction of name knowledge to initiated specialists, and association of improper naming with physical or psychological harm. The differences involve specific theological frameworks explaining the prohibitions, particular grammatical structures employed for circumlocution, and varying strictness in enforcement ranging from absolute prohibition to contextual restrictions. The question of independent development versus cultural transmission remains unresolved for most cases. Egyptian and Mesopotamian name prohibitions likely involve some degree of cultural transmission, given extensive documented contacts between these civilizations. Hebrew and Mesopotamian connections remain possible but uncertain. Hindu and Mesopotamian traditions show no clear transmission routes despite conceptual parallels. Mesoamerican practices definitely developed independently, providing the clearest evidence that name prohibition can emerge without cultural transmission from known sources. The global distribution of name prohibition practices supports two non-exclusive interpretations. First, these practices may represent universal human responses to encounters with phenomena that humans across cultures experience as requiring name concealment for safety or proper relationship. Second, these practices may derive from extremely ancient common sources predating the geographical separation of human populations, preserving in various forms the remnants of shared knowledge from humanity's deep past. Both interpretations suggest that Mesopotamian name prohibitions participated in patterns extending far beyond their specific cultural context. The persistence of these practices across millennia and their independent emergence in isolated populations indicate they addressed fundamental aspects of human religious experience rather than representing arbitrary cultural constructs. The convergence of independent traditions on similar protective strategies suggests these approaches proved effective for managing whatever realities they addressed, whether those realities consisted of psychological phenomena, social dynamics, or genuine encounters with entities requiring such protection. The formalization of name prohibition through state legal codes demonstrates that these restrictions transcended religious convention to become matters of civil law, enforced by royal authority. Administrative texts from the 3rd dynasty of Ur, approximately 2100 to 2000 BC, contain explicit royal decrees enforcing the name prohibition and specifying punishments for violations. Tablet UET 327 describes penalties, including temple service obligations, property confiscation, and banishment for individuals who speak the forbidden names or attempt to write that which must remain unwritten. The formalization of these prohibitions within royal law codes demonstrates that maintaining the name taboo was considered essential to state security rather than merely religious preference. The 3rd dynasty of Ur, also known as the Ur-3 period, represented one of ancient Mesopotamia's most centralized and bureaucratically sophisticated states. The dynasty's founder Ur-Nammu and his successors created an administrative system characterized by detailed record-keeping, standardized legal codes, and centralized control over religious institutions throughout their empire. The integration of name prohibition enforcement into this state apparatus indicates that protecting these restrictions ranked among the government's fundamental responsibilities, alongside maintaining public order, collecting taxes, and defending territorial boundaries. Tablet UET 327, excavated from Ur during the joint British Museum and University of Pennsylvania expeditions conducted by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, and currently housed in the British Museum, dates to the reign of Shulgi, approximately 2090 to 2047 BC. Shulgi ruled for 48 years and is remembered as one of ancient Mesopotamia's most effective administrators, implementing reforms that standardized weights and measures, reorganized temple administration, and codified legal practices throughout his empire. The inclusion of name prohibition enforcement within his legal reforms demonstrates the importance attributed to these restrictions at the highest levels of government. The tablet opens with standard legal formula attributing the decree to royal authority. By the order of Shulgi, king of Ur, king of Sumer and Akkad, these laws are established. The text then proceeds through a series of conditional clauses specifying prohibited behaviors and their corresponding penalties, following the format typical of Mesopotamian law codes. The conditional structure employs the formula if a man followed by description of the prohibited act, then followed by specification of the penalty, creating clear legal standards that could be applied consistently across different cases. The first prohibition addresses verbal utterance of forbidden names. If a man speaks aloud the names of the 7 silent ones, or if he whispers these names where others might hear, or if he teaches these names to one not authorized to receive them, then he shall serve in the temple of Enlil for a period of 3 years, performing the lowest labors without compensation, and his property shall be forfeit to the temple treasury. The 3-year temple service obligation represented substantial punishment, essentially enslaving the violator to temple authority for an extended period during which they would perform menial tasks including cleaning, carrying, and maintenance work that free citizens normally avoided. The property confiscation component of the penalty demonstrates the state's economic interest in enforcing these prohibitions. The forfeited property transferred to temple treasuries, providing material benefit to religious institutions while simultaneously impoverishing violators and their families. The economic impact created powerful deterrent against violations while enriching the temples responsible for maintaining the unnamed entity ceremonies. This financial structure aligned state and religious interests in enforcing the prohibitions. The second prohibition addresses written violations. If a man inscribes upon clay or stone or wood the names that must not be written, or if he preserves in writing any record of these names, or if he makes copies of texts containing these names without authorization from the temple authorities, then his writings shall be destroyed, his house shall be torn down, and he shall be banished beyond the borders of the land for a period of 7 years. The destruction of writings ensured that any unauthorized name documentation was eliminated, preventing proliferation of dangerous knowledge. The house demolition created dramatic public demonstration of the violation's seriousness, while eliminating the physical location where the offence occurred. The 7-year banishment penalty removed violators completely from society, sending them beyond the kingdom's borders, where they would lose all social connections, property rights, and legal protections. Banishment for 7 years matched symbolically the number 7 associated with the unnamed entities throughout Mesopotamian tradition, creating numerical correspondence between the violation and its punishment. The banished individual faced survival challenges in foreign territories and would return, if they survived, to a society where they had lost all social standing and material resources. The third prohibition addresses improper ceremonial participation. If a man intrudes upon the silent ceremonies without proper authorization, or if he attempts to learn through observation or questioning what occurs within the sealed chambers, or if he reveals to unauthorized persons any knowledge of these ceremonies, then he shall be subject to the judgment of the temple council, which may impose penalties up to and including death, according to the severity of the intrusion. This provision delegated enforcement to temple authorities, while establishing that violations could warrant capital punishment, indicating the state recognized these restrictions as matters of life and death importance. The delegation of judgment to temple councils for ceremonial violations reflects the specialized knowledge required to assess these cases. Civil authorities might lack the religious expertise to determine whether specific actions constituted genuine violations or fell within permitted boundaries. Temple councils possessed the theological knowledge necessary to evaluate violations accurately and to determine appropriate responses that would both punish offenders and protect society from consequences of the violations. Additional clauses in the tablet address various specific scenarios that might constitute violations. The text prohibits unauthorized individuals from possessing written materials containing the forbidden names, even if they did not create the materials themselves. It prohibits speaking about the unnamed entities in public spaces where general populations might overhear. It prohibits artistic representations that might depict the entities, even without naming them. The comprehensiveness of these provisions indicates systematic attempt to prevent any form of unauthorized dissemination of restricted information. The enforcement mechanisms specified in the decree include provisions for reporting suspected violations and for investigating accusations. Citizens who reported violations received rewards from the forfeited property, creating financial incentives for surveillance of potential violators. Temple officials possessed authority to conduct investigations, including searching private residences for unauthorized written materials. Accused individuals could defend themselves before royal judges, but the burden of proof fell on the accused to demonstrate their innocence, rather than requiring accusers to prove guilt beyond doubt. The severity of the penalties and the comprehensiveness of the prohibitions indicate that three authorities considered name prohibition violations as serious threats to social order. The legal code's language emphasizes protecting the kingdom from dangers that would result from naming violations, employing terminology normally reserved for threats like rebellion, foreign invasion, or plague. This framing positioned name prohibition enforcement as essential to state security, rather than as enforcement of religious rules that concerned only temple institutions. The survival of similar legal provisions in texts from other Mesopotamian cities during the III period indicates these were not merely local laws, but empire-wide standards enforced throughout territories under III control. Tablets from Nippur, and Lagash contain parallel legal texts specifying comparable penalties for name prohibition violations, demonstrating coordinated legal policy across the empire. This standardization required active dissemination of legal codes and training of local officials in their enforcement, indicating substantial administrative investment in maintaining the prohibition system. The practical implementation of these laws appears in administrative records documenting actual cases of violations and punishments. Tablet UET 543 records a case from the reign of Amar-Sin, Shulgi's son and successor, involving a scribe accused of copying unauthorized texts containing forbidden names. The record documents the investigation, the evidence presented, the temple council's judgment finding the scribe guilty, and the execution of penalties including destruction of the unauthorized texts, confiscation of the scribe's property, and his assignment to 7 years temple service rather than banishment due to his specialized skills that the temple wished to utilize. The integration of name prohibition into civil law codes persisted beyond the Ur-3 dynasty. Later, Mesopotamian legal collections, including the Code of Hammurabi from approximately 1750 BC, contain provisions addressing violations of religious prohibitions that legal scholars interpret as references to name taboos. The continuity of legal enforcement across multiple dynasties and legal traditions demonstrates sustained governmental commitment to protecting these restrictions through state power. The architectural manifestation of these legal restrictions appears in the physical design of temple spaces dedicated to ceremonies involving unnamed entities. Archaeological analysis of temple complexes across Mesopotamia reveals architectural features specifically designed for conducting ceremonies to unnamed entities, including acoustically isolated chambers, labyrinthine approach corridors, and spaces configured to prevent direct visual observation. The temple at Girsu contains a chamber accessed through a corridor that makes 7 right-angle turns, creating complete acoustic and visual isolation from surrounding temple spaces. The architectural precision invested in creating these isolated ritual spaces suggests their function was considered essential to temple operations, despite serving entities whose identities could not be publicly acknowledged. The temple complex at Girsu, modern Tello in southern Iraq, served as the religious centre for the city-state of Lagash during the early dynastic and Ur-3 periods. Excavations conducted by French archaeological teams, beginning in 1877 and continuing sporadically through the 20th century, uncovered extensive temple structures dedicated to the city god Girsu, along with subsidiary temples serving other deities. Among these structures, excavators identified architectural anomalies that suggested specialized functions beyond standard temple operations. The most significant of these anomalous structures consists of a ceremonial chamber located in the northeastern sector of the main temple complex, accessible only through an elaborate corridor system that creates exceptional isolation from surrounding spaces. The corridor begins at an inconspicuous entrance positioned behind the main temple's northern exterior wall, easily overlooked by casual observers and showing no external markings or decorative elements that would attract attention. The entrance measures only 1.2 meters in height and 0.9 meters in width, requiring individuals to stoop slightly while entering and preventing passage of large groups simultaneously. The corridor extends inward for approximately 3 meters before making the first of 7 90-degree turns. Each turn occurs at intervals ranging from 2.5 to 4 meters, creating a zigzag pathway that extends the total corridor length to over 35 meters, despite the chamber's location only 15 meters in direct line from the entrance. The corridor walls, constructed from fired brick laid in precise courses, maintain consistent width of 1.1 meters throughout the passage, allowing single-file movement but preventing individuals from walking side by side. The acoustic properties created by this 7-turn configuration demonstrate sophisticated understanding of sound propagation and isolation. Each right-angle turn functions as a baffle that prevents sound transmission around corners, effectively blocking both sound entering from outside the corridor and sound emanating from the chamber from travelling back toward the entrance. Modern acoustic testing conducted in the partially preserved corridor structure revealed that sounds produced at the chamber would be completely inaudible at the entrance, while sounds from the surrounding temple complex would similarly fail to penetrate to the interior chamber. The visual isolation created by the corridor configuration equals or exceeds the acoustic isolation. The 7 turns create absolute visual separation, making it impossible for anyone outside the corridor to see into the chamber or for anyone within the chamber to see out. This visual barrier prevented unauthorized observation of ceremonies conducted within the chamber, while simultaneously preventing those conducting ceremonies from being distracted by external activities. This psychological effect of progressing through the maze-like corridor, making 7 turns in darkness or minimal illumination, would create strong sense of separation from the normal temple environment. The chamber itself, measuring approximately 8 meters by 6 meters, with ceiling height of 3.5 meters, shows architectural features designed for ceremonial use while maintaining complete anonymity regarding its dedicatory purpose. The floor consists of limestone slabs fitted with exceptional precision, creating a level surface throughout the chamber. The walls, plastered smooth and painted with a neutral grey tone, lack any carved reliefs, painted imagery, or inscriptions that would identify the chamber's purpose or the entities worshipped within it. The chamber contains a raised platform positioned against the eastern wall, constructed from carefully fitted stone blocks and measuring 3 meters wide by 1.8 meters deep. The platform stands 0.7 meters above the floor level, creating an elevated surface clearly designed for ritual use. The platform's top surface shows extensive wear patterns and chemical residues indicating centuries of use for offerings and ceremonies. However, no dedicatory inscriptions mark the platform, and the wall behind it shows no niche or mounting points for divine statuary that would normally accompany such an altar platform. The ceiling construction reveals additional sophistication in the chamber's acoustic design. The ceiling consists of corbelled brick vaulting that creates a dome-like overhead space, rising approximately 0.8 meters above the nominal 3.5 meter wall height at the chamber center. The corbelling pattern creates acoustic focusing effects that concentrate sound toward the chamber's center point, enhancing the audibility of words spoken from the platform while creating unusual resonance characteristics. The acoustic focusing would enable ceremonies to be conducted with relatively quiet voices that would still be clearly audible throughout the chamber while remaining inaudible outside due to the corridor's sound-blocking properties. Ventilation for the chamber comes through a series of small channels built into the walls near the ceiling level. These channels, each approximately 15 centimeters in diameter, connect to vertical shafts that rise through the temple superstructure to roof level, providing fresh air circulation without creating openings large enough for sound transmission or unauthorized observation. The ventilation system's sophistication indicates careful engineering to maintain air quality during extended ceremonies while preserving the chamber's isolation characteristics. Archaeological evidence indicates the chamber remained in continuous use from approximately 2500 BC through at least 1700 BC, a span of 8 centuries representing one of the longest continuous use periods for any structure at the site. The wear patterns on the platform and floor, the accumulation of residues, and the evidence of periodic maintenance and repair all demonstrate sustained importance of this chamber's functions throughout multiple dynasties and political transitions. Similar architecturally isolated chambers appear at other Mesopotamian temple sites, suggesting standardized design principles for spaces dedicated to unnamed entity worship. The temple complex at contains a comparable chamber accessed through a 5-turn corridor. The Nippur temple includes underground chambers with labyrinthian access passages. The temple at Uruk features acoustically isolated spaces positioned deep within the temple complex. The consistency of these architectural solutions across different cities and time periods indicates shared understanding of the spatial requirements for conducting ceremonies to unnamed entities. The investment in creating these specialized architectural spaces demonstrates that unnamed entity worship demanded physical infrastructure comparable to that provided for major named deities. The precision of the construction, the sophistication of the acoustic and visual isolation systems, and the sustained maintenance of these facilities across centuries all indicate these were not marginal or peripheral religious spaces, but essential temple facilities whose functions justified substantial architectural investment. The economic evidence quantifies the material resources devoted to maintaining unnamed entity worship within temple institutional frameworks. Temple economic records document substantial resource allocation to ceremonies for unnamed entities. Tablet CBS 14,792 records annual expenditures for the silent ceremonies totaling approximately 15% of the temple's entire operating budget. The quantities of rare materials, specialized personnel requirements, and elaborate preparation procedures documented in these accounts demonstrate that worship of the nameless entities represented major institutional commitment rather than minor or peripheral religious practice. Tablet CBS 14,792 from the University of Pennsylvania's collection originates from the Temple of Enlil at Nippur and dates to approximately 1900 BC during the Old Babylonian period. The tablet represents an annual budgetary summary that consolidated expenditures across all temple activities, providing comprehensive view of resource allocation priorities. The document format follows standard Mesopotamian accounting practices with itemized expense categories, quantities specified in standard measurement units, and totals calculated in silver shekels as the standard monetary value. The total annual operating budget for the Enlil Temple, documented in this tablet, amounts to approximately 13,500 shekels of silver, representing enormous economic scale comparable to major state institutions. This total encompasses all temple activities, including daily offerings to Enlil and subsidiary deities, maintenance of temple structures and personnel, support for temple workshops producing various goods, and administration of extensive agricultural lands owned by the temple. The allocation of specific portions of this budget reveals institutional priorities and the relative importance attached to different religious functions. The category designated as expenditures for the silent ceremonies receives allocation of 2,050 shekels of silver, representing 15.2% of the total budget. This substantial allocation positions unnamed entity worship as one of the temple's major expense categories, comparable to allocations for festivals honouring Enlil himself and exceeding expenditures for several named subsidiary deities. The economic data demonstrates that unnamed entities commanded resources proportional to their perceived importance, rather than receiving only token support. The itemization of silent ceremony expenditures reveals the specific types of costs involved in maintaining unnamed entity worship. The largest single expense category within the silent ceremonies allocation addresses procurement of specialized offering materials totaling 1,200 shekels annually. This category includes rare incense varieties not used in standard temple ceremonies, precious stones meeting exacting quality specifications, exotic woods imported from distant regions, and animal offerings that required specific breeding and preparation protocols. The premium prices paid for these specialized materials reflect both their rarity and the ceremonial requirements that restricted acceptable sources and quality levels. Personnel costs for the silent ceremonies total 600 shekels annually, supporting specialized priests who conducted these ceremonies exclusively. The salary levels for these priests exceeded standard temple priest compensation by approximately 40%, reflecting the specialized training required, the restrictions on revealing knowledge, and the physical and spiritual risks associated with conducting ceremonies to unnamed entities. The higher compensation also served as incentive for maintaining secrecy, as priests who revealed forbidden information would lose their lucrative positions along with facing legal penalties. Infrastructure maintenance costs for the silent ceremonies total 150 shekels annually, covering upkeep of the specialized chambers, corridor systems, and equipment used in unnamed entity worship. These costs included periodic resurfacing of chamber floors, replacement of worn platform stones, maintenance of ventilation systems, and repair of acoustic isolation features. The ongoing maintenance requirements indicate these facilities required constant attention to preserve their specialized functions. Preparation costs for ceremonial materials total 100 shekels annually, covering the extensive processing required to produce offerings meeting the exacting specifications for unnamed entity ceremonies. These costs included labor for grinding specialized flours, processing rare oils, preparing purification compounds, and creating ritual equipment according to precise protocols. The preparation processes often required weeks or months of labor, creating substantial costs beyond the raw materials themselves. The accounting records track expenditure timing throughout the year, revealing that silent ceremony costs concentrated during specific periods corresponding to the astronomical windows when these ceremonies could be safely conducted. Major expenditure spikes appeared during months when planetary configurations created the barrier openings described in astronomical texts, with procurement of materials and preparation activities ramping up in advance of these ceremonial windows. This temporal concentration of expenditures demonstrates that unnamed entity worship followed systematic scheduling rather than occurring randomly throughout the year. Additional economic documentation from other temple archives confirms that the 15% budget allocation found at Nippur represents typical, rather than exceptional levels of institutional commitment to unnamed entity worship. Tablet from Babylon dating to 1600 BC shows silent ceremony allocations of 14% of that temple's budget. Records from document 12% allocation during the Ur-3 period. The consistency across different temples and time periods indicates standardized institutional priorities that persisted across Mesopotamian civilization. The economic records also document the sources of funding for unnamed entity ceremonies, revealing that these expenditures came from general temple revenues rather than from special dedicated income streams. This general fund financing indicates that unnamed entity worship represented core temple functions, supported through the same economic mechanisms that funded all essential religious activities, rather than being treated as specialized optional services requiring separate funding. The scale of resources devoted to unnamed entity ceremonies raises questions about the return on investment that temples expected from these expenditures. Unlike offerings to named deities that could be publicly celebrated and credited with specific benefits when favorable outcomes occurred, the secretive nature of unnamed entity worship prevented public recognition of any benefits received. The sustained high-level funding despite lack of public acknowledgement suggests temple authorities considered the benefits crucial, even if they could not be openly discussed. The economic evidence demonstrates that unnamed entity worship consumed substantial material resources that could have been allocated to other purposes, including expanded worship of named deities, enhanced temple facilities, or reduced taxation of temple dependents. The choice to maintain these high expenditure levels across centuries indicates persistent institutional belief that these ceremonies provided essential benefits that justified their costs. The economic commitment transforms unnamed entity worship from speculative religious practice into core institutional function deemed worthy of major resource allocation. The encounter between Mesopotamian traditions and Greek intellectual frameworks during the Hellenistic period provides external perspectives that help evaluate these practices from viewpoints outside the Mesopotamian cultural context. When Alexander the Great conquered Babylon in 333 BC, Greek scholars accompanying his expedition documented encounters with Mesopotamian religious practices, including ceremonies to unnamed deities. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in Greek around 280 BC, describes divine beings whose names bring ruin if spoken, but whose favour brings prosperity if properly sought through silent veneration. His account provides external Greek perspective, confirming that the name prohibition represented active religious practice during the Hellenistic period, rather than merely preserved ancient texts describing obsolete customs. The Hellenistic conquest of Mesopotamia created unprecedented opportunities for cultural exchange between Greek and Mesopotamian intellectual traditions. Alexander's policy of founding Greek cities throughout his conquered territories and encouraging mixed Greek and local populations generated environments where different cultural perspectives encountered each other directly. The Greek intellectual tradition's emphasis on rational inquiry and systematic knowledge collection motivated Greek scholars to document and analyze the religious practices they encountered in Mesopotamia, creating valuable external records of these traditions. Berossus represents the most significant bridge figure between Babylonian and Greek intellectual worlds during the early Hellenistic period. Born in Babylon during the late 4th century BC, Berossus served as a priest of Marduk and received traditional Babylonian education in cuneiform literacy, astronomy, and religious traditions. However, he also learned Greek language and literature, enabling him to communicate Babylonian knowledge to Greek audiences. Around 280 BC, Berossus wrote his Babyloniaca, a 3-volume history of Babylon from creation to his contemporary period, composed in Greek for Greek readers. The Babyloniaca itself does not survive in complete form, but substantial fragments are preserved through quotations by later Greek and Roman authors, including Josephus, Eusebius, and Syncellus. These fragments provide crucial evidence about how a Babylonian priest explained his native traditions to Greek audiences unfamiliar with Mesopotamian cultural contexts. Berossus's willingness to write about unnamed entity worship while respecting the prohibition against revealing actual names demonstrates that the restrictions persisted even when addressing foreign audiences who had no cultural obligation to respect Mesopotamian religious conventions. The fragment preserved by Eusebius in his preparation for the Gospel contains Berossus's description of unnamed divine beings. There exist among the divine powers certain beings whose true names it is forbidden to speak aloud, for their names possess such potency that their utterance brings ruin upon the speaker. These beings dwell in the deep places beneath the earth and in the highest reaches of heaven, far removed from common divine congress. They grant favour and prosperity to those who approach them through proper silent veneration, conducting ceremonies at appointed times according to the movements of celestial bodies, but they visit madness and destruction upon any who presume to speak their names or to seek knowledge of their true forms. This description, written in Greek for a Greek audience, employs conceptual frameworks that would resonate with Hellenistic readers, while accurately conveying the essential elements of Mesopotamian unnamed entity traditions. The reference to names possessing potency aligns with Greek philosophical discussions about the nature of language and the relationship between words and reality. The spatial designation placing these beings beneath the earth and in highest heaven corresponds to Greek cosmological models, while preserving the Mesopotamian concept of unnamed entities occupying distinct realms separate from the recognized divine hierarchy. The emphasis on proper timing according to celestial movements reflects Berossus's own expertise in Babylonian astronomy, which he had previously demonstrated through astronomical writings that influenced Greek astronomical traditions. His explanation of unnamed entity ceremonies as requiring astronomical timing presents these practices as rational procedures based on scientific knowledge rather than arbitrary superstitions, making them more comprehensible to Greek audiences who valued rational explanations. The consequences described for improper naming, madness and destruction match the medical and legal texts from Mesopotamian sources, demonstrating that Berossus accurately conveyed the practical concerns underlying the prohibition rather than softening or rationalizing them for Greek consumption. His willingness to explain that violation would cause madness indicates he considered this a genuine danger, requiring serious warning rather than a cultural convention that could be dismissed when addressing foreigners. Additional fragments of Berossus's work preserved by other authors provide further details about unnamed entity worship. Synkelus quotes a passage describing the architectural features of Babylonian temples, including sealed underground chambers where the silent ceremonies were conducted, away from the observation of common worshippers. This description matches archaeological evidence of isolated temple chambers while explaining their function to Greek readers unfamiliar with Mesopotamian temple architecture. The Greek response to Berossus's accounts reveals varying interpretations of Mesopotamian unnamed entity traditions. Some Greek philosophers incorporated these concepts into their own theological frameworks, identifying parallels between unnamed Mesopotamian entities and Greek philosophical concepts of transcendent divine principles that exceeded naming or rational comprehension. The Neoplatonic tradition developed elaborate theories about unnameable divine realities that may have been influenced by Mesopotamian traditions transmitted through authors like Berossus. Other Greek writers treated Berossus's accounts with skepticism, viewing the prohibition against naming as evidence of primitive superstition or priestly manipulation designed to maintain exclusive power. These critical Greek perspectives provide valuable evidence that unnamed entity worship remained active and significant enough during the Hellenistic period to attract critical attention, rather than being merely preserved textual traditions of historical interest. Greek travellers and scholars who visited Babylon during the Hellenistic and Roman periods documented ongoing ceremonies to unnamed entities, providing independent confirmation of Berossus's accounts. A travel account preserved in fragmentary form describes a Greek visitor being denied access to certain temple chambers during his tour of Babylon, with priests explaining that these spaces were dedicated to rituals whose recipients could not be named even to foreign visitors. The visitor's frustration at being excluded from these areas demonstrates that the restrictions remained actively enforced, rather than being relaxed to accommodate curious foreigners. The persistence of unnamed entity worship through the Hellenistic period despite Greek cultural dominance indicates that Babylonian religious institutions maintained their traditional practices even when operating within Greek political and cultural frameworks. The willingness of figures like Berossus to explain these practices to Greek audiences while maintaining the actual prohibitions demonstrates sophisticated navigation between cultural translation and preservation of essential restrictions. The Greek documentation of Mesopotamian unnamed entity traditions provides crucial external validation that these practices represented genuine religious activities observed by foreigners rather than purely literary constructions or conventional phrases that had lost practical meaning. The Greek perspectives, written from outside the Mesopotamian cultural framework and often skeptical of religious claims, nonetheless confirm the basic facts about unnamed entity worship, including the prohibition against naming, the elaborate ceremonies conducted in isolated spaces, the astronomical timing requirements, and the perceived dangers from violations. Recent archaeological discoveries raise profound questions about how modern science should approach spaces that ancient civilizations deliberately sealed and forbade from disturbance. Recent excavations using ground-penetrating radar and other non-invasive technologies have identified sealed chambers beneath major Mesopotamian sites, that match textual descriptions of spaces dedicated to unnamed entities. In 2019, surveys at Ur detected a large chamber beneath the ziggurat complex that corresponds precisely to references in tablet UET 468, describing the sealed house of the seven silent ones. The chamber remains unsealed pending decisions about excavation protocols, raising questions about whether modern archaeology should access spaces that ancient civilizations deliberately sealed and prohibited from disturbance. The ground-penetrating radar survey at Ur was conducted by an international team from the British Museum, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Iraqi State Board of Antiquities and Heritage as part of a comprehensive non-invasive assessment of the site's subsurface archaeology. The survey employed multiple geophysical techniques including ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, and magnetometry to create detailed three-dimensional maps of buried structures without disturbing the ground surface. The survey's primary goals involved assessing preservation conditions, identifying areas of archaeological interest for potential future excavation, and documenting the site's extent and complexity. The anomaly identified in the 2019 survey appears on radar images as a large void space approximately 25 meters beneath the ziggurat's northwestern corner. The chamber measures approximately 15 meters by 12 meters, based on radar reflections, with estimated ceiling height of 5 meters. The size and configuration match descriptions in tablet UET 468, which specifies dimensions and positioning for an underground chamber designated as the sealed house of the seven silent ones. The precision of the correspondence between the textual description and the detected chamber strongly suggests this represents the actual structure referenced in the ancient text. The radar data reveals additional details about the chamber's construction and current condition. The chamber walls show distinctive reflection patterns consistent with fired brick construction, matching the building materials specified in the ancient texts. The void space appears to be intact rather than collapsed or filled with debris, indicating that the chamber's structural integrity has been maintained through approximately 4 millennia of burial. The presence of an intact void space this large and this deep represents unusual preservation, as most ancient underground structures have experienced some degree of collapse or infilling over such extended time periods. The access route to the chamber appears on radar as a narrow sloping passage descending from within the ziggurat's core structure. This passage shows the same multi-turn configuration described in texts addressing ceremonial chambers for unnamed entities, with the radar detecting at least 4 right-angle turns along the descent route. The passage terminates at what appears to be a sealed doorway based on distinctive radar reflections, indicating dense material blocking the passage terminus. The door appears to be intact rather than having been breached, suggesting the chamber has remained sealed since its final closure in antiquity. The discovery immediately generated intense debate within the archaeological community regarding appropriate responses. Some archaeologists argued for immediate excavation to document the chamber's contents, before deterioration or looting might compromise the site. Others advocated for continued non-invasive study using increasingly sophisticated remote sensing technologies that might reveal chamber contents without physical intrusion. A third group raised ethical questions about whether modern archaeology should open chambers that ancient civilizations deliberately sealed with explicit prohibitions against disturbance. The ethical questions prove particularly complex given the religious and cultural context surrounding unnamed entity worship. The ancient texts make clear that the sealing of these chambers represented religious acts intended to permanently protect both the chamber contents and human populations from harmful interactions. The prohibitions against disturbing sealed unnamed entity spaces appear throughout Mesopotamian legal and religious literature, with language indicating serious consequences for violations. Modern excavation of deliberately sealed religious spaces raises questions about respecting ancient religious intentions and about potential cultural appropriation of sacred spaces. The Iraqi authorities who hold primary responsibility for decisions about excavation at Ur convened consultations with religious scholars, archaeologists, ethicists, and representatives of communities claiming cultural descent from ancient Mesopotamian populations. These consultations revealed diverse perspectives on the appropriate approach. Some participants argued that modern secular archaeology operates under different frameworks than ancient religious prohibitions, and that scientific investigation should proceed without restriction, based on ancient religious beliefs that modern investigators do not share. Others contended that respect for cultural heritage requires honouring the intentions of the people who created these sites, including their religious restrictions on access. The practical considerations included assessment of potential risks from excavation beyond the abstract ethical questions. The chamber's 4,000-year sealed environment may contain atmospheric conditions, chemical concentrations, or biological materials that could prove hazardous to excavators or could deteriorate rapidly upon exposure to modern atmosphere. The opening of similarly sealed ancient chambers has occasionally released toxic gases, caused rapid oxidation of preserved materials, or exposed workers to harmful substances. The sealed, unnamed entity chamber presents unknown risk profile that prudent archaeological practice suggests should be carefully evaluated before access. The potential contents of the chamber create additional considerations. The ancient texts describing sealed houses of the Silent Ones indicate these spaces contained ceremonial equipment, offering materials and possibly written records documenting the unnamed entities' identities and characteristics. If such records exist and remain preserved within the sealed chamber, their discovery would provide unprecedented evidence about the beings concealed behind millennia of prohibition. However, the same texts warn that encountering this information produces harmful effects, raising questions about how modern researchers should approach potentially dangerous knowledge. The decision regarding the sealed chamber remains unresolved as of the current date, with the chamber remaining sealed while consultations continue. The site is monitored to prevent unauthorized access while Iraqi authorities and international archaeological partners evaluate the various perspectives and develop protocols that might enable investigation while respecting cultural and ethical considerations. The extended deliberation period reflects serious engagement with the complex questions raised by this discovery, rather than reflexive application of standard excavation practices. Similar sealed chambers identified at other Mesopotamian sites face comparable questions. Ground-penetrating radar surveys at Babylon, Nippur, and Uruk have all detected sealed underground spaces that match descriptions of unnamed entity ceremonial chambers. Each discovery generates renewed debate about appropriate responses and about whether modern archaeology possesses adequate frameworks for addressing sites deliberately sealed with religious prohibitions. The accumulation of multiple discoveries makes these questions increasingly urgent as the number of sealed chambers known to exist continues to grow. The technological advances that enable detection of sealed chambers without disturbing them also provide potential alternatives to traditional excavation. Advanced remote sensing technologies, including cosmic ray muon tomography, thermal imaging, and chemical vapor analysis, might eventually enable investigation of sealed chamber contents without physical intrusion. These technologies could provide scientific data about chamber contents while respecting ancient intentions to keep the spaces sealed. However, the technological limitations of current remote sensing prevent comprehensive investigation equivalent to physical excavation. The unsealed chambers represent potential repositories of knowledge about one of ancient Mesopotamia's most persistent mysteries, the true identities of the beings concealed behind millennia of prohibition. The written records that might exist within these chambers could potentially answer fundamental questions about why these entities required name concealment, what characteristics made them dangerous, and whether the prohibitions reflected genuine supernatural realities or served other social or political functions. Yet the same ancient sources that describe these sealed chambers warn that accessing the knowledge they contain brings madness and destruction. The modern archaeological community's wrestling with these questions demonstrates appropriate caution about the potential consequences of disturbing ancient sealed spaces. Whether the dangers described in ancient texts represent genuine supernatural threats, psychological effects from encountering disturbing information, or social consequences from violating cultural prohibitions, the prudent approach involves careful consideration before proceeding. The decision to leave the chambers sealed pending further evaluation shows respect for both the ancient intentions and the possibility that the prohibitions address real dangers that modern science does not yet understand. The discovery of these sealed chambers and the debates about accessing them bring the ancient unnamed entity traditions into direct engagement with modern archaeological practice, creating circumstances where contemporary researchers must grapple with the same questions that occupied Mesopotamian priests for thousands of years. The persistence of these questions across millennia demonstrates their enduring significance and the profound challenges posed by entities whose very names were considered too dangerous to write. The accumulated evidence across 3 millennia of Mesopotamian civilization reveals a systematic, sophisticated, and surprisingly consistent program of concealing specific divine identities while maintaining elaborate worship practices directed toward these unnamed entities. The archaeological discoveries of purpose-built anonymous temples, the linguistic development of specialized prohibition grammar, the astronomical precision applied to ceremony timing, the substantial economic resources allocated to nameless worship, the formalization of prohibitions within state law codes, and the persistence of these practices through multiple linguistic transitions and foreign conquests all demonstrate that unnamed entity traditions represented core institutional commitments rather than peripheral esoteric curiosities. The convergence of independent evidence domains creates a compelling case that these prohibitions address genuine concerns rather than arbitrary cultural conventions. The medical texts documenting specific symptoms from improper naming, the legal codes specifying severe penalties for violations, the architectural investments in isolated ceremonial spaces, and the sustained high-level economic support across centuries all indicate Mesopotamian civilization treated these restrictions as essential protective measures. The adoption of identical practices by culturally independent populations, including the Kassites and the Persians, along with parallel traditions in geographically separated cultures worldwide, suggests these prohibitions may have emerged in response to universal human experiences rather than representing unique Mesopotamian innovations. The nature of the entities concealed behind these prohibitions remains the fundamental mystery that all the accumulated evidence cannot definitively resolve. The texts describe beings of immense power, whose names possessed intrinsic danger, whose forms exceeded safe human perception, and whose nature placed them outside the normal divine hierarchies, yet granted them capabilities that warranted elaborate ceremonial attention. Whether these represent psychological archetypes, social constructs serving political functions, preserved memories of actual historical encounters with non-human intelligences, or genuine supernatural entities that ancient peoples experienced directly, the evidence demonstrates that Mesopotamian civilization maintained sophisticated systems for managing relationships with whatever realities these unnamed entities represented. The modern discovery of sealed chambers beneath Mesopotamian sites, matching textual descriptions of spaces dedicated to the 7 silent ones, creates unprecedented opportunity to potentially access direct evidence about these entities' identities. Yet the very existence of this opportunity raises profound questions about whether contemporary civilization should disturb spaces that ancient peoples deliberately sealed with explicit warnings about the dangers of access. The ancient prohibitions maintain their force across 3,000 years of continuous tradition, surviving dynastic changes, foreign conquests, linguistic transitions, and cultural transformations that eliminated countless other aspects of Mesopotamian civilization. This extraordinary persistence suggests the prohibitions addressed concerns that transcended any particular historical context. The unsealed chambers represent a threshold between ancient mysteries and modern knowledge, between respect for cultural heritage and scientific investigation, between acknowledging the limits of current understanding and pursuing knowledge regardless of ancient warnings. How contemporary civilization navigates this threshold may reveal as much about modern values and assumptions as about the ancient entities whose names remain, even now, too dangerous to write. The nameless gods continue their vigil in darkness, their identities protected by millennia of silence, waiting to discover whether the prohibition that preserved their concealment through the rise and fall of empires will survive the curiosity of an age that believes all knowledge should be accessible and all mysteries should yield to investigation.